Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The night air felt heavier than usual, as if the entire world were pressing down on me. A single porch light illuminated the wooden boards in front of my house, casting distorted shadows across the yard. Even from inside, I could sense a presence, something just beyond the range of clear vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I stared through the peephole, heart pounding a warning rhythm. For a fleeting moment, I considered not opening the door at all. But curiosity, or perhaps an unnamed dread, propelled me forward. And when I finally stepped onto the porch, the night felt more alive than it ever had, crackling with an oppressive energy I couldn't quite explain. I live in a modest house nestled in a calm suburban neighborhood. There's a small strip of lawn and some hedges that border the property, all fairly typical. However, I've always been particularly fond of my wooden front porch. The boards have a certain creak to them that I found oddly comforting. At least that was before the night everything changed. I never questioned my sense of security here. Nothing about this neighborhood had ever made me feel unsafe. But the first time I heard those slow, deliberate footsteps creaking across my porch in the middle of the night, every bit of comfort vanished. I remember jolting awake, uncertain of the hour. The house was cloaked in darkness, save for a faint glow from the streetlight slipping through the blinds. My heart pounded wildly before my brain could even register the reason. Then I heard it again. A soft, measured tread on the wooden boards just outside my door. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I could practically taste the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Who would be out there at that time of night? I held my breath, straining to pick up any additional clues, a voice perhaps, or some indication of who or what was standing on my porch. When the sound stopped abruptly, I forced myself to get up. My hands trembled as I flicked on the lamp by the living room couch. I halfway expected to see a silhouette in the window, but there was only my own reflection staring back, looking pale and shaken. Gathering what little courage remained in me, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. No figure, no movement, just a lingering sense that someone or something was still there. My muscles twitched with the impulse to fling the door open, but a sudden chill ran through me. Despite the fear, I needed to confirm what was going on. So I twisted the lock and pulled the door wide. Empty night. Cool air rushed past me. The porch light flickered, casting uncertain shadows across the yard. My eyes scanned the darkness, and I felt a growing knot in my stomach when my gaze caught a vague shape out near the sidewalk. It wasn't a person standing in any normal sense. Rather, it looked like a tall, shadowy outline that seemed to be looking directly at me. The distance and poor lighting made it impossible to see the face, but the figure's posture exuded an unsettling stillness. I reached for the light switch to illuminate the walkway, but by the time the stronger light came on, the figure was gone. Only the bushes swayed slightly, though there was no breeze whatsoever. That was the beginning. The next day, I told a friend over the phone about the incident, using a forced laugh to mask my lingering unease. I said that maybe it was just some random passerby or possibly a trick of my half-awake imagination. Yet, deep inside, I knew it hadn't been my imagination. Something was out there, aware of me, and I felt watched. Over the following nights, my sleep turned fitful. Every squeak of the old wooden boards filled me with prickling dread. Several times I shot out of bed, certain I had heard steps on the porch again. But when I'd investigate, porch light in hand, I found nothing but the emptiness of my own front yard. The only constant was that same oppressive hush in the air, as though the world around me was holding its breath. Days passed without any repeat appearance of that figure by the sidewalk, and a small part of me began to hope that whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, had moved on. But about a week later, I was jolted out of my uneasy sleep by a different sound, something like claws or nails scraping against the wood. My entire body seized up with terror. My mouth went instantly dry. I fumbled for the flashlight on my nightstand, knocking it over as I tried to steady my trembling hand. When I managed to switch it on, a narrow beam cut through the darkness of my bedroom. My breath sounded impossibly loud in the silence. I crept to the door and hesitated. That scratching noise, which had been so clear moments earlier, was gone now. Gathering every ounce of courage I could muster, I opened the door to confront whatever was out there. Again, the scene looked deceptively normal. The boards didn't appear damaged, nor did I see any creature or intruder lurking about. But the air felt wrong, thick, suffocating. I recalled that old trope from stories, where the protagonist feels eyes upon them. It might sound cliché, but in that moment, it was the only way to describe it. I could swear I was being observed from some hidden vantage point. My mind conjured images of that shadowy figure behind the hedges, crouched and waiting. The next morning, determined to shake my growing paranoia, I walked around the yard to look for footprints. When I say footprints, I mean anything. A shoe impression, an animal track, something to let me label this terror as either human or beast. And I did find something. Faint imprints leading from the sidewalk to the porch. They were strange, almost elongated, but not so distorted that I could immediately rule out a large boot. The tracks came up onto the porch, circled once near a support beam, and then simply vanished in the middle of the boards. There was no continuation. It was as if the visitor had lifted off the ground. My stomach clenched at the thought. I told myself it must be a trick of the light or maybe an incomplete print, but deep down, I felt my rational explanations slipping away. From that point on, my nights took on a different rhythm. Instead of drifting into a peaceful slumber, I lay awake, ears attuned to every creak, pop, or groan of my house. I started to notice that the hush outside was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I would sometimes get up and look through the blinds, scanning the yard for any movement. The light from the street lamp seemed to flicker more often now, or perhaps I was simply more aware of its every fluctuation. Shadows shifted, but always at the periphery of my vision, vanishing when I tried to focus on them. On one of those nights, I caught a glimpse of something near the bushes. The shape was low, as if crouching. My throat tightened, and I felt my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Without even realizing it, I had a hand pressed to my chest, as if to calm the erratic thumping. I squinted, desperate for any detail, a limb, a face. But it was just a dark, irregular form, like a twisted branch or a hunched figure. The longer I stared, the more I felt its gaze upon me. My mind screamed for me to back away, turn off the lights, do anything other than stand there. But I couldn't move. A cold sweat gathered at my temples and my legs locked in place. It felt like hours before the shape pulled back into the shadows. Only then did the tension in my muscles release, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. By the time dawn arrived, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I began doubting my own sanity. I questioned whether these sightings were real, or if I was succumbing to some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Perhaps I was becoming unhealthily obsessed with a random intruder, but even that rationalization felt hollow, because deep down I knew there was something more. The footprints that ended abruptly, the scraping on the porch, the unnatural presence looming beyond the hedges. These weren't the actions of a mere trespasser. I tried to confide in a neighbor. I mentioned in a shaky tone that I'd been hearing odd noises at night. The neighbor offered a half-concerned, half-puzzled expression, then suggested that it might just be a raccoon. I nodded politely, but I didn't believe it. And even while recounting my ordeal, I noticed how my voice faltered. The sheer weirdness of it all made me sound like someone grasping at straws. Still, I quietly hoped that talking about it with another person might diminish the sense of dread, but it only accentuated how alone I felt in facing this. A few more nights passed with the same routine. The weighty silence, the heightened tension in every joint of my body, the subtle yet unmistakable sense of being watched. Then, one evening, I heard that scratching again, but this time it was different. More frantic, as though something was trying to get beneath the boards. My skin prickled at the urgency of the sound. Instead of rushing to the door, I stayed inside, pressing my ear against the wood, trying to figure out what the creature was doing. I could feel vibrations resonating through the floor. Panic flooded my system. The adrenaline spike made my breath hitch, and I tasted copper in my mouth from biting my lip too hard. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That something invisible was creeping around my porch at night. At last, the scratching stopped. An hour might have passed, or maybe only 5 minutes. It was impossible to tell in my agitated state. When I finally dared to open the door, the night was as it always looked. Dark, silent, empty. My flashlight beam skimmed over the wooden boards, revealing deep gouges that definitely hadn't been there earlier. They looked like claw marks, each about an inch or two long, raked into the wood. Terror hardened in my gut. That's when I spotted movement near the bushes. The shape was back, a smudge of black against the darkness, barely noticeable. But it made no sound, no discernible movement except for a subtle shift that hinted it was turning to look at me. I slammed the door shut, my heart in my throat. For a moment I stood frozen in the entryway, my hand gripping the doorknob with sweaty intensity. Then I hurriedly locked it. But even that didn't bring me comfort. I flicked on every light in the house, hoping to chase away the shadows. My living room lamp cast harsh illumination on the walls, revealing just how alone I really was. My mind buzzed with thoughts. Should I leave? Should I stay up all night? Should I try to confront it? Sleep was impossible. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw that figure behind my eyelids. I felt phantom claws scraping against my consciousness. I kept imagining the wooden board splitting open, something slithering underneath. My sense of reason began to crumble, replaced by a primal fear. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow became a potential threat. I had never felt so vulnerable in my own home. Desperate, I spent the following day reinforcing my porch. I hammered down any loose boards and even spread a light dusting of flour on the steps, hoping to capture clearer footprints if this entity returned. My nerves were on edge the entire time, and I constantly glanced over my shoulder, sure I would see that indistinct figure lurking across the street. The sun felt weak against my skin, as if it couldn't fully dispel the dread embedded in my bones. Night fell again, unrelenting. I sat by the window, lights out, trying to remain calm enough to observe. The flower on the porch glowed faintly under the porch light. Around midnight, the boards creaked. My lungs seized. It was happening again. But I refused to rush to the door this time. Instead, I stayed behind the blinds, watching. The creaking moved slowly across the porch, like something prowling back and forth. Then I heard that raspy scratching. My ears rang with the sound, my breath ragged and shallow. After a few moments, the movement stopped, and an unsettling silence took hold. I forced myself to look out the window, heart hammering, certain I'd see footprints in the flower. What I saw made my stomach twist. There were indeed prints, but they were elongated, almost animal-like, weaving across the porch. Partway through, they simply ended. No step forward, no step backward. Just a sudden stop in the middle of the boards, as if the creature had vanished. A surge of cold terror rippled through me. My vision blurred at the edges and my hands shook uncontrollably. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of reality. There was no logical explanation for something disappearing into thin air. My mind reeled with horrifying possibilities. Was this entity even bound by the laws of nature? Could it come and go at will, mocking me? I couldn't take it anymore. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed a camera and crept onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight, echoing the footsteps that had plagued me. My legs wobbled, and it took all my willpower to remain steady. I snapped a few pictures of the footprints and the fresh claw marks. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. In the faint circle of the porch light, I could see the flower disturbed where the tracks ended, as if the last footprint belonged to a ghostly presence that simply dissolved into thin air. Suddenly, the bushes rustled, louder this time, and I whipped around. There it was, the silhouette standing just beyond the railing, half hidden behind the leaves. It was taller than I had thought, elongated limbs or perhaps a cloak. My throat constricted. My legs screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted. Slowly, as if gauging my reaction, the shape leaned forward. I sensed its eyes, though I couldn't make them out. A wave of primal fear crashed through me. My entire body broke into a cold sweat, and I gasped for air. I couldn't look away, even though every cell in my body wanted to. In a moment of frantic resolve, I aimed the camera, but the shape slid deeper into the shadows, obscured by the thick foliage. A flash of movement, then only swaying branches remained. The night was otherwise dead silent. My chest rose and fell with ragged gasps. I nearly collapsed, my legs giving out from the tension. Eventually, I forced myself back inside, locking the door and sliding down against it, camera clutched in trembling hands. I never did capture a clear image of that thing, but the footprints and the shredded wood on my porch are evidence enough to remind me it was real, or something close to real. I considered leaving for a while, maybe staying at a friend's place, but a stubborn part of me refused to surrender my home. Still, the lingering terror persists. Even as I write this, I can feel that uncomfortable prickle along my neck, as though unseen eyes are fixed on me. I haven't heard the scratching in a few days, nor have I spotted the figure behind the bushes. I've tried to convince myself that maybe it's gone for good. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself listening, heart pounding in my ears, certain I'm about to hear the soft creak of the porch boards. Every so often I peek outside, only to spot a fleeting shape retreating behind the hedges. In those moments, a shuddering realization hits me. This presence, whatever it is, might not be bound by rational logic. Perhaps it's a projection of my own fear, or perhaps it's something far worse that stalks the edges of reality. I've reached a point where I don't know what to trust anymore. My senses, my sanity, even the ground beneath my feet. Yet a part of me refuses to fully give in. This house may not feel like the safe haven it once was, but it's mine. I refuse to let an otherworldly intruder rob me of my courage. Whether it's supernatural or a twisted psychological manifestation, I'm preparing for its return. I've decided that if it comes back, I'll face it again. I have no idea if I stand a chance, or if confrontation will only make it stronger. All I know is that living in constant terror isn't living at all. So here I am, forcing myself to wait out each night, heart thundering in my chest, breath shallow. Every rustle of leaves sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I am both terrified and resolute. Maybe I'll find a way to banish this thing, or maybe I'll discover a truth too horrifying to comprehend. But for now, I sit with my camera close by and my eyes fixed on that porch, uncertain whether I'm standing at the brink of madness or on the threshold of something far more unfathomable. And in the midnight hush, I can swear I hear the faintest echo of footsteps, a haunting reminder that whatever lurks out there hasn't finished with me yet. I still remember the electric hum in the air that evening, a pulsing energy that clung to my skin the moment I stepped onto the crowded street. Multicolored paper lanterns cast wavering lights on the pavement, and the distant thrum of festival music pounded against my temples. Even before I noticed anything strange, I felt a subtle tension in the atmosphere, as if the night itself were breathing shallowly, anticipating something. My heart thudded a little too hard for a simple celebration, and the smell of fried dough and spiced meats somehow intensified my nausea instead of tempting my appetite. Lights blinked erratically overhead, and every shadow seemed to expand beyond its natural boundary. Amidst the laughter and bustle, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, as though someone's eyes were locked on me from afar. I tried to brush off the unease, convincing myself it was just an overactive imagination triggered by fatigue. But as I wove through the throngs of strangers, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure standing a few feet away, partially hidden behind a vendor stall. His posture was rigid. There was something about the tilt of his head that made my stomach clench. I saw a faint gleam of metal in his hands, a camera pointed directly at me. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Why would he be photographing me, of all people, at a busy night festival? But the lens was undoubtedly aimed in my direction. My heartbeat grew louder, and a film of sweat formed on my forehead. I glared at him, hoping to convey that I did not appreciate being his subject. Instead of reacting with a typical startled expression or backing off, he only smiled. It was a smile I cannot easily describe. His lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that seemed too straight and too luminous under the flickering lanterns. It was as if he were mocking me, daring me to confront him. I swallowed hard, pulse racing, and tried to lose myself in the crowd, pressing deeper into the throbbing sea of strangers. Yet, every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was there, always a few steps behind, camera in hand. Moments later, I paused near a stall, displaying a cascade of colored ribbons. My vision was overwhelmed by the swirling patterns, but I managed to catch another glimpse of him just beyond the fluttering silks. He raised the camera again, capturing another shot. My entire body tensed. My hands felt clammy, and the nape of my neck was slick with nervous perspiration. Why was he so intent on following me? I stepped sideways, hoping to blend with a group of festival goers who were admiring the crafts. But a quick glance to my right confirmed that he was still there. Though the music blared and countless bodies jostled past, I felt completely alone in that suffocating crowd. Desperate to calm myself, I took my phone out, deciding to snap a picture of him as proof of this bizarre harassment. My heart pounded in my ears. The camera app opened, but my hands trembled so violently that focusing on his figure was nearly impossible. When I tapped the shutter, the result came out blurry, as if my phone struggled to capture him in focus. Each attempt produced a smudge where his face should have been. My breath grew uneven, and the sensation in my chest made me wonder if I was imagining things or if there was a genuine glitch. Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I decided to stare him down again. I turned fully, intending to confront him from a distance. This time I noticed a curious distortion in the space around his head. It reminded me of a heat wave shimmering on hot asphalt, except it was happening at night, and it clung specifically to him. The intensity of his smile grew, and it looked even more unnatural. My breath caught as I realized I was probably seeing something that should not exist in a normal, rational world. A nauseating wave of confusion flushed through me. I felt my pulse hammering so fiercely that I was sure he could see my chest rising and falling in panicked bursts. I heard a group of people nearby, and it sounded like they were chatting about some performance happening at the next block. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Maybe I should join them, pretend to be part of their group, if only to escape his line of sight. I sidled closer to them, but the crowd shifted unpredictably. A swirl of confetti rained down from above as a parade of dancers passed through. Those bright, fluttering pieces of paper in the night sky felt wrong, as though they were mocking my unease. In the swirl and surge of bodies, I lost sight of the man for a moment. Relief swept over me, until I felt a distant prickle on my spine. He was still there, not gone, but merely repositioned. Every time I tried to confront him, he slipped into an alley or behind another stall. Each time I moved, that scalding wave of anxiety in my stomach grew. I was more aware of each breath, each bead of sweat sliding down my temples. My mouth was so dry that I could barely swallow. At one point, I heard the faint shutter click of his camera and turned just in time to see him lowering it, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of having taken another photograph. In the background, the hum of music and laughter seemed distant, almost dissonant, like a broken soundtrack over an unsettling film reel. I decided I had to put an end to this twisted game. Forcing my shaking legs to move, I marched straight in his direction. The crowd parted for a moment, granting me a clearer line of sight, and I accelerated. But, with each step forward, he seemed to drift away, as if the crowd swallowed him whenever I got too close. Shouts and cheers from the festival mingled with my ragged breathing. My chest felt tight, and a deep pressure weighed on me from all sides. It seemed impossible to corner him in the surge of dancing bodies and neon strobes. After several minutes of frantic pursuit, I spotted him standing under a dimly lit archway near the end of the street. The air was thick with smoke from nearby grills, and the smell of charred meat twisted my stomach. I approached, heart thumping so forcefully I could scarcely think straight. He didn't move. He merely waited, camera in hand, face partially obscured by the uncertain light. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I stepped forward, raising my voice. Though I can barely recall what I said, it was something accusatory, demanding to know why he was following me, what he wanted from me. The response came in a whisper, more like a cold gust that prickled my skin. He told me, in that chilling voice, that I didn't belong here. The words cut through the chaos of the festival, sharp and invasive. The immediate rush of dread that took hold of me was nearly physical, as though an icy hand clutched my heart. The temperature should have been sweltering, but his presence emanated a bitter chill that made my extremities tense. In that moment, my mind spun with 1,000 questions, none of which I could articulate properly. I stepped closer, teeth chattering despite the heat, and asked him what he meant. But a flicker of movement in the crowd momentarily blocked my view. When I looked back, the archway was empty. He had vanished. No lingering shadow, no echo of footsteps. My chest heaved with every breath, and my palms shook against my thighs. That chill remained, burrowing under my skin. Confusion and dread spread through me like poison, making it hard to think logically. I frantically scanned the sea of festival attendees, hoping to catch a glimpse of his unnerving smile, but all I saw were laughing faces, neon lights, and swirling confetti. Desperation gnawed at me. I forced my way through clusters of strangers, peering over shoulders and craning my neck in every direction. Fear throbbed against the inside of my skull. My surroundings seemed off-kilter, as if the entire festival had taken on a subtly twisted shape. The lighting flickered unpredictably, casting elongated shadows that danced on the ground. Distant music once again felt jarring and malevolent, a pulse beating in disharmony with my own rapid heartbeat. At times, I thought I caught a faint silhouette in my peripheral vision, a shape drifting between the stalls. Each time I spun to face it, I came up short, greeted only by startled strangers who seemed more concerned about my frenzied behavior than anything else. I tried to reason that maybe I was just losing my mind, seeing illusions born from my anxiety. Perhaps the distorted face in the photos was an artifact of my shaking hands or poor lighting. My mind, however, replayed the moment he whispered that I didn't belong, and that deep chill in his voice stayed with me. I recalled the way his face seemed to shimmer, resisting the camera's focus. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something sinister lurked behind those images and that haunting half-smile. A strange dizziness settled in. My breath turned ragged, and my thoughts spiraled into paranoia. I scanned every face in the crowd, convinced he might be lurking behind any of them. The entire festival felt drenched in menace. Colors appeared too bright, almost neon in intensity, stinging my retinas. I found myself stumbling against a table of souvenirs, knocking over a few trinkets. The vendor glared at me, but I couldn't even muster an apology. My heart was racing too fast. I had an overwhelming urge to flee, yet I was too terrified to leave without answers. At one point, I sought refuge near an old fountain decorated with festival ribbons. The water trickled in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that did nothing to steady my nerves. I cupped my hands in the water, splashing my face in an attempt to ground myself. The sensation of cold liquid on my skin momentarily cleared my head. Gathering courage, I glanced around, determined to spot him if he was still nearby. But everything seemed normal for a fleeting second. Groups of friends laughing, vendors calling out to potential customers, and couples dancing to distant music. My racing pulse told me otherwise. Then in a flash, I glimpsed him across the fountain. He was partially obscured by a tattered banner advertising some local attraction. My entire body locked up. He lifted his camera slowly, almost ceremoniously, and pressed the shutter. This time I saw the bright burst of the flash. In that burst, his face wavered, like a reflection in disturbed water, refusing to take solid form. When the flash ended, he was gone again, vanished into the clamor as though he had never existed. My head pounded, and a tremor ran down my spine. I found myself panting as if I had just sprinted for miles. That was when I accepted I might be entangled in something far beyond rational comprehension. My legs felt unsteady, and I staggered, leaning against the fountain's edge. I had an urge to talk to anyone, to share this horrifying experience, but I doubted anyone would believe me. There was no evidence except a string of useless photos that refused to show his face. My mind pulsed with the memory of his words. "You do not belong here." The statement reverberated within me like a warning, or perhaps a declaration of something unspeakably bleak. Summoning what remained of my courage, I forced myself to walk toward the heart of the festival again, each step a monumental effort. The possibility that I would see him once more twisted my stomach, yet an equal dread filled me at the idea of never knowing what he truly was. Everywhere I looked, I saw glimpses of his silhouette, or heard the phantom clicking of his camera shutter. I began to question my own sanity, half expecting the street to warp under my feet, or the lantern lights to blink out in unison. I pushed through the crowd, passing a swirl of confetti and neon lights that flickered overhead like an unsettling omen. Sweat drenched my shirt. My pulse hammered relentlessly, and my breath was so shallow that my chest began to ache. The festival's noise pressed in, suffocating me with its unnatural cheer. At times, the shadows stretched unnaturally, as though reaching out to ensnare me. My mind reeled with the conviction that I could never again see a festival the same way. Despite my mounting terror, an unexpected determination took root. If I truly did not belong there, I wanted to find out why. I peered into every side street and alley, searching for any last trace of him. But the more I looked, the more I realized the night was slipping away, and with it, the faint chance of confronting him again. The tension in the air gradually receded, replaced by an aching emptiness. The absence of that haunting presence felt, in its own way, like an even crueler torment, an unresolved horror, an open wound with no closure. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of the festival, where the lights were dimmer and the crowds thinned out. The music had faded into a distant echo. My heart was still pounding, and every nerve in my body remained on high alert. But he did not appear again. The final remnants of the celebration carried on behind me, seeming oblivious to the terror that had stalked me all night. With a sense of resignation, I slipped away from the festivities and stepped onto a quieter street. My legs felt wobbly, and the air tasted stale in my mouth. My thoughts raced. Had the man been a ghost, a trick of my overwrought mind, or something far more alien? No matter how I turned the questions over in my head, I couldn't reconcile them with any normal explanation. I remembered the icy grip of his hand and the blurred face in the photographs. I could still feel his cold breath near my ear when he spoke those words. Even with him gone, the chill lingered in my bones. I continued walking, trying to create distance between myself and that unnerving scene. Yet, my relief felt hollow. My skin prickled with the lingering certainty that his gaze might still be following me, intangible, yet potent. By the time I reached my car, my breathing was somewhat steadier, but my throat remained tight and parched. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors immediately, my fingers trembling on the ignition. It was as though I expected him to materialize beside me at any moment. As I drove away, the city lights flickered in the rearview mirror. The festival was still visible in the distance, a swirl of artificial brightness. My shoulders ached from tension, and my mind spun with the memory of his final declaration. No part of me felt victorious. All I carried was a lingering dread that pulsed beneath my skin like a latent infection. I wondered if I truly did not belong, if I was somehow an intruder in a place that tolerated my presence, only until he arrived to shatter the illusion of safety. To this day, I still glance over my shoulder whenever I'm out at night. The flash of a camera, or the flicker of strange light sets my teeth on edge. The memory of his translucent smile, and the blank space where his face should have been, continue to haunt my dreams, leaving me gasping awake with my heart pounding. He has not reappeared, but I sense something in the night that I can't fully articulate. a formless dread that suggests I've seen too much or perhaps too little. And whenever I feel a cold breeze on my neck, I recall his whispered warning. It echoes through my mind, a lingering testament to that uncanny night, reminding me that true horror often lies in what remains unresolved. I woke up one evening with my heart already hammering, as if some silent alarm had pulled me from sleep. The room felt colder than usual, my breath catching in my throat as I exhaled little wisps of condensation. I remember sitting up, feeling my shirt cling to my skin with cold sweat. Every inch of my body was tense. Something was off, and even in that dark, half-awake state, I could sense I wasn't entirely alone. That was the first true sign that my old college roommate's reappearance was anything but ordinary. And looking back, it was the moment that marked the beginning of a suffocating horror I never imagined I'd face in my own home. I'm 27, living with my best friend Todd, in a small suburban house on the outskirts of the city. The place has always been peaceful. At least it used to be. There's a tree-lined street out front, just enough yard space for a grill and some lawn chairs, and windows that let in plenty of sunlight, when the blinds are open anyway. After everything that happened, I'm not so sure I can even enjoy sunlight the same way again. I recall the day I got that unexpected message from Drew, my ex-roommate from college, who I never particularly liked. We were assigned to share a dorm room during my freshman year. I tolerated him more than anything else, and as soon as the semester ended, we went our separate ways. For nearly half a decade, I heard nothing about him. Then he suddenly reached out, claiming he lived nearby. He insisted he wanted to visit to catch up and reminisce about the good old days. The message was short and bland, yet it carried a strange, heavy aura, something intangible that made my gut twist. I tried to brush it off as nerves or leftover annoyance from our history together, but deep down, I sensed that reconnecting with him would lead to trouble. I let Todd know that a person from my past was dropping by. Todd was indifferent. He said I should do what I needed to do, but teased me about how edgy I'd become. He even commented that I looked like I'd been losing sleep, that maybe meeting an old friend could do me good. But it wasn't friendship driving Drew. I felt more like he was drawn to me, drawn to something in my life. When Drew showed up at my doorstep for the first time, I found myself sweating uncontrollably. My palms were clammy, and my mouth went dry. I could see him through the small window in the door. He looked almost the same as he did back in college. Thin, slightly hunched. A typical figure you wouldn't give a second glance on a crowded street. But he felt different. There was a vacant shadow in his eyes, a kind of emptiness that made my skin prickle. The air around him seemed charged with static, and it might sound cliché, but I couldn't ignore the sudden chill that swept into the hallway the moment I opened the door. It was one of those bone-deep chills, as though someone had left a freezer open in the middle of summer. I tried to breathe steadily, tried to keep my voice even as I welcomed him. When he stepped inside, my living room lights flickered once and then cut out. I offered some excuse, something about old wiring, but a spike of fear rippled through me. I remember the instant tension in my shoulders. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly it drowned out the rustling of the trees outside. Todd came downstairs moments later, not suspecting anything wrong, and chatted politely with Drew. Or at least, Todd attempted to chat. Drew mostly responded with short, awkward nods or monosyllabic answers. I tried to keep the conversation moving, but my throat felt like sandpaper, and my heart wouldn't slow down. After he left, which thankfully didn't take too long, I paced around the house trying to figure out why I was so tense. That was when I pulled out an old college photo album. I wanted to see if I was overreacting or simply dredging up old grudges. Then I saw it. The black smudges. In almost every photo where Drew appeared, there were dark stains around him. They looked like ink spills or mold creeping in from the edges. But these photos were digital prints, and I stored them carefully. There's no reason they should be damaged like that. I remembered flipping through them so many times in the past, and the images were perfectly fine. Now, it was as if an unsettling shadow had bled through the paper wherever he stood. I showed Todd a couple of pictures the next day, saying there was some weird discoloration. He dismissed it as age or cheap ink, but admitted it was strange how the blotches formed little tendrils around Drew's figure. He wondered if something in the printing process had reacted to the chemicals. Still, seeing those dark stains made my stomach lurch. In the week that followed, Drew found excuses to stop by more frequently. He would show up unannounced, sometimes in the early evening or right after dusk, always wearing the same unblinking gaze. He mentioned that he lived close by, which felt odd because the neighborhood is small and I'm usually aware of new residents. Every time he arrived, a door somewhere in the house would slam shut on its own. Sometimes it was the front door, sometimes a closet, sometimes the door to the basement. The first couple of times Todd and I blamed the wind or a draft, but the doors that banged didn't even face open windows or vents. Meanwhile, the lights in my bedroom began to flicker and burn out more frequently. Bulbs I'd replaced days before would die with a soft pop, leaving me in the dark, heart pounding. My nights became restless. I kept dreaming about Drew's face, looming in the corner of my vision. In the dream, a thick shadow always stretched out behind him, twitching like a living thing. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing so hard I thought I might black out. And each morning, I'd think of ways to avoid letting him in if he stopped by. Yet every single evening, I found myself opening the door, feeling that terrible chill crawl up my spine as I tried to smile and act calm. Drew never really said much, but he was always around, lurking like a shadow cast across my life. I started feeling unsettled at every moment, even when he wasn't there. The house took on a different mood, like the walls themselves were watching me, absorbing my fear. I'd often shiver involuntarily, my skin crawling with goosebumps as though an unseen presence hovered inches away. Then I started noticing him in places he shouldn't be. For instance, I'd catch sight of his reflection in the bathroom mirror when I was alone in the house. He'd be standing in the doorway, head slightly cocked, while I splashed water on my face. The moment I spun around, there would be no one there, just an empty hallway. Another time I was warming food in the microwave, staring at the reflective surface on the door. I could see the shape of someone behind me, but when I turned, the kitchen was empty. My body locked with dread, and I could barely breathe. My hands trembled so violently that I almost dropped the plate on the floor. One day, after he left, I found Todd in the living room looking pale and anxious. He told me he hadn't seen anything weird exactly, but that every time Drew was around, an oppressive heaviness settled over the house. Todd was even losing focus at work, because he found himself dreading the moment he might hear a knock at the door. He said maybe it was time to talk to Drew and ask for space, though Todd felt uneasy about the idea of confronting him directly. I tried talking to Drew indirectly, through text, to find out more about why he kept visiting. He responded with curt messages, offering no real explanation. Then he'd show up again the next day with that same chilly aura, never volunteering a reason for his presence. The rational part of me screamed that this behavior was wrong. My instincts told me to cut him off altogether, but there was this creeping sense that Drew knew something I didn't, that maybe he was feeding off my fear. I can't quite explain why I let it continue. It was as if I was paralyzed by the situation, unable to form a decisive plan. On an impulse, I rummaged through old yearbooks and digital photo folders, searching for more images of Drew. Almost every single one had those black stains around him. They clung to his figure like an oily aura, and in some shots, they stretched out across the page, resembling long fingers or tendrils. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and I felt sick to my stomach. My heart hammered so fast that I had to sit down, pressing my palms to my knees to stop them from shaking. I wondered if maybe there was some natural explanation, but I couldn't ignore the stifling sense of dread that twisted in my gut. It was around this time that I began doubting my own sanity. I'd find myself double-checking the locks on the windows, expecting to see him outside, just standing there, his eyes locked on mine through the glass. I jumped at every small noise, a branch scraping the house, a gust of wind rattling the fence. My nights became endless loops of half-sleep and jolting awake in cold terror. Sometimes I'd wake and swear I saw a silhouette in the corner of the bedroom, looming near the closet door. But whenever I summoned the courage to flick on the light, I found nothing but an empty room. Todd tried to reassure me, though he admitted he was just as rattled. He suggested we move or at least temporarily stay at a hotel, but I hesitated, feeling too paranoid to leave the house unoccupied. Something in me believed that if I left, Drew would follow. That intangible, bone-chilling presence would come along wherever I went. I became convinced that the darkness clinging to him was not just attached to him but was seeping into my world, as if I had unknowingly allowed it. Then came the night I found him outside my bedroom window. It was close to midnight, and I'd been staring at the ceiling, mind racing with anxious thoughts. I got up to get water from the kitchen. As I passed by the window in the hallway, I saw a tall shape in the dim porch light. My chest tightened. The shape was just standing there, motionless, gazing up at me. Even through the shadows, I recognized Drew's posture, his distinct silhouette. I froze, gripping the windowsill so hard that my nails dug into the wood. The edges of my vision grew dark for a moment, and I had to remind myself to breathe. When I blinked, he was gone. No movement, no sound, as if he'd evaporated into the night air. My hands shook so badly that the glass of water I fetched nearly slipped from my grasp. The next morning, I dragged Todd into my room and explained everything in a low, urgent voice. He listened, his face tense. He wasn't dismissive. In fact, he revealed that he'd noticed footprints in the backyard dirt, footprints that didn't match either of ours. They led from the fence straight to the side of the house, then vanished. Todd suggested calling someone, maybe the cops or even a private security firm, but we both knew what we'd say. Our old friend keeps showing up, and he leaves behind bizarre black stains and photos and kills our light bulbs. It sounded unhinged. I was beginning to feel unhinged. That same day, Todd left for work while I stayed home. I had used some of my vacation days because I couldn't focus at the office. The house was quiet, painfully so, and the silence itself made my skin crawl. I locked all the doors and closed the curtains, leaving only a single lamp on in the living room. Every creak of the floorboards made my pulse spike. It was mid-afternoon when I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. My lungs seized with dread. I grabbed the lamp cord, ready to yank it out of the socket if the overhead lights flickered. Sure enough, as soon as I stood up, the bulb in the lamp popped and went out. Darkness filled the living room, except for the faint glow filtering through the covered windows. I stood in near total darkness, breath ragged, fighting an urge to run. My entire body was trembling, and my mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I whispered to myself, trying to keep calm, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard the faint squeak of a door hinge. The basement door, to be exact. My stomach twisted. The door is old, rarely used, but it has a distinct squeak. I forced myself to move toward it, heart hammering so hard that I felt a dull ache in my chest. When I reached the top of the basement stairs, the smell of damp concrete and stale air wafted up at me. The door hung partially open, though I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I flicked on the basement light, and for once, the bulb didn't blow. A weak yellow glow lit the stairs. I stepped down, slowly. My legs felt like jelly, my entire body so tense that each step made me grimace. The basement was empty, cluttered only with boxes and old furniture. But the air felt heavier than ever, like a storm cloud had settled inside. I stood in the center of the room, straining to listen. My breath sounded deafening in my ears. Then, without warning, the light above me flickered a few times, casting odd shadows on the concrete walls. My shadow stretched out unnaturally, and for a split second, it looked like another figure was standing behind me. My blood went cold. I spun around but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had brushed against my shoulder. My skin tingled where I felt the slight contact. I fled back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me and locking it twice. My heart felt close to bursting out of my chest. I stayed by that door for a long time, breathing in ragged gasps, trying to convince myself that I was in control. But the fear was too overwhelming. It wasn't just a regular fright. It was a primal certainty that something unnatural was closing in around me. I could practically taste the darkness in the back of my throat. That evening, Todd came home. The sun had set and the house was steeped in long shadows. I told him I couldn't stay here anymore. My voice shook, and my hand still trembled from the basement episode. He agreed, saying we should go to his parents' house across town. We hurriedly packed a few essentials, hearts pounding at every little noise. I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the windows, expecting to see Drew's face there, watching us. Just before we left, there was a soft knock on the front door. We both froze. My skin erupted in goosebumps so intense it almost felt painful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a jolt of sheer terror shot through me. I put my hand on the doorknob, feeling the metal's icy chill. Todd begged me not to open it, but I felt compelled. My heart pounded like a drum, making it hard to hear anything else. My breath came in shallow spurts as I turned the knob, slowly, dread clinging to every movement. Standing on the porch was Drew, wearing that same vacant expression. The streetlights cast strange shadows around him, making his thin frame look elongated and wrong. The air turned frigid, as if a cold front had just swept through the yard. I felt my teeth clatter. That bone-deep chill overwhelmed me again. In the dim glow of the porch light, I noticed a faint dark haze around his shoulders, like curling smoke or an indistinct silhouette. It wasn't my imagination. This was real as the fear burning in my veins. He didn't say a word. He just stared. I backed away, nearly stumbling over my own feet. Todd, standing behind me, inhaled sharply. I sensed that something else was on the porch with Drew, an unseen presence coiling in the darkness. A wave of nausea washed over me, and my vision blurred for a second. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I forced my voice to remain steady as I told him we were leaving and that he needed to go. He tilted his head as if considering the statement, then stepped forward. My heart thundered in protest, and every hair on my body prickled with fear. But then, something in my mind snapped, a desperate need to resist whatever force he carried. I held up my hand, palm out, and repeated that he needed to go. The atmosphere changed. The cold lingered, but Drew seemed to hesitate. The shadows around him flickered, almost as though they were alive and reacting to my resistance. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline that steadied my shaking legs. With trembling words, I told him I wanted no more visits, no more unannounced drop-ins. My breath was shallow, but my voice was resolute. He stared a moment longer, then stepped back slowly. An expression that might have been annoyance, or was it disappointment, crossed his features. He turned and walked off into the night, disappearing beyond the glow of the streetlight. The suffocating chill eased, but it didn't vanish. The porch still felt colder than the rest of the world. Todd and I locked the door, grabbed our things, and rushed to his car. My heart didn't stop racing until we were miles away. We spent the next few nights at Todd's parents' place. I didn't sleep well at all, constantly haunted by the thought of Drew lurking outside. When we finally mustered the courage to go back to our house, I expected the worst. Maybe more burnt-out bulbs or open doors. Instead, I found everything locked up, exactly how we left it. The shadows didn't feel quite as menacing, yet I couldn't ignore a lingering heaviness in the air. It was as if something had seeped into the walls and corners, some residue of that presence. I still catch myself looking over my shoulder in the hallways, especially around dusk. The lights don't burn out as often, but sometimes I hear doors creak when there's no draft. And occasionally, in the quieter hours of the night, I think I see a shape in the window. A flicker of movement, a silhouette that fades as soon as I focus on it. I can't say for certain if Drew is truly gone or if he's just waiting, but I do know that something about him changed, something that can't be explained by mere coincidence or old grudges. Todd wants us to move eventually, and I agree it might be best. Yet I'm not convinced leaving the house will free me from the horror that Drew brought back into my life. There's a permanent awareness now, a dread that lives under my skin, prickling every time I remember the black stains in those photos, or the spine-chilling cold that followed his footsteps. Part of me wonders if this sense of unease will follow me wherever I go, an invisible mark left behind by a man I never truly knew, and by the thing that might have been clinging to him all along. Even if I never see him again, I can't unsee the dark haze that seemed to snake around him, or the way doors slammed themselves. I can't unfeel that raw, paralyzing fear that gripped me each time he appeared in my reflection when I was alone. Some doors, once opened, can never fully be closed. And now, as I stand here staring at my own mirror, heart thudding in my chest, I swear I catch the faintest glimpse of Drew behind me, just for an instant. The chill returns, crawling up my spine, and a single thought lodges itself in my mind. Perhaps he was never just a man to begin with, and perhaps I have invited something far worse into my home than an unwelcome old roommate. The moment I first set foot in that basement apartment, something felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows along the hallway were too elongated, and every creak of the floorboards overhead gave me a quiet sense of dread I couldn't quite place. I remember standing at the threshold, feeling as though I had crossed into a space not meant for me, like I was intruding on something old and watchful. But I told myself I was being paranoid. The price was right, and the landlord had assured me the space had been recently renovated. It was just an old house with a bit of character, or so I tried to convince myself. In hindsight, I realize I should have paid more attention to the subtle warnings. That creeping cold in the pit of my stomach might have saved me from nights of restless fear and that final moment of indescribable horror. I moved in on a cloudy afternoon, my breath catching in my throat every time I looked at the battered wooden steps leading from the main floor down to the basement. The walls were painted a pale gray that seemed to soak up the dim light rather than reflect it. My living area was basically one large room, sectioned off by a bookshelf and a half wall that separated the kitchen. A narrow corridor led to the bathroom and a small storage closet. It was an odd layout, supposedly the result of a hasty renovation by the previous owner. Almost immediately, little things started to put me on edge. The first night, as I was unpacking boxes and stacking books, I heard a gentle shuffling outside my door, a faint swish of fabric against the walls. I froze in place, heart pounding, and listened for a full minute, but it stopped as soon as I held my breath to concentrate. I told myself it was nothing more than my imagination combined with the groans and sighs of an old building settling at night. A couple of days later, I caught a whiff of something stale and musty, like damp earth mixed with dusty cloth, drifting through the corridor. I assumed the smell was seeping in from some hidden corner of the house. After all, older buildings often had that musty odor. Still, I found myself constantly checking the corners of my basement apartment, certain I would find evidence of mold or water damage, but there was nothing. The walls were dry, the floor was solid. Yet sometimes, especially late at night, I could swear the smell would intensify, as if something was drawing closer. I tried to go about my routines, preparing simple meals, tidying up, and keeping my mind occupied. But every so often I would feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone I couldn't see. My muscles would tense, and my heart would accelerate. Then I would force myself to exhale, look around, and realize I was, at least visually, completely alone. That uneasy feeling, however, never fully vanished. If anything, it built up over time, like a slow crescendo of dread in the back of my mind. The landlord occasionally passed through the house during the day, checking the heating system or making sure the old pipes weren't leaking. One afternoon, he casually mentioned that the house had belonged to a family of collectors long ago. He spoke about it briefly, as if it was just a bit of trivia. The former residents had traveled widely, amassing peculiar artifacts that apparently cluttered every corner of the property. He said he had heard rumors that certain pieces had been hidden in walls or under floorboards. I recall feeling a wave of unease roll over me at the thought of living atop who knows what kind of hidden trinkets or curios. The idea of stumbling upon some relic gave me chills, though I tried to shrug it off as an overactive imagination. Night after night, the footsteps grew more consistent, It started as a single pair of measured steps in the corridor adjacent to my apartment. The pace was deliberate, almost like someone walking with a cane, though I never heard the tapping of any cane. It was just the slow, rhythmic thump of footsteps heading toward my door, then pausing, and eventually fading away. I would open the door sometimes, thinking maybe a neighbor had wandered down by mistake, but I never found anyone. I recall one evening, I had just finished washing dishes and was drying my hands when the lights flickered and dimmed. My heart skipped a beat. The bulbs, which were relatively new, buzzed faintly and then returned to full brightness. In that brief, stuttering moment of half-light, I could have sworn I saw a silhouette in the kitchen doorway, tall and unnaturally still. A rush of cold air closed around me, and I broke into a shudder. When the lights went back to normal, there was no one. Yet I was certain I hadn't imagined it. My palms were sweating and my pulse hammered in my ears. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at the slightest sound. By the second week, the footsteps came almost nightly. I began losing sleep. My breathing became shallow whenever darkness fell, as if my body was instinctively bracing for whatever might come stalking through the corridor. Worse, the corridor's single overhead bulb had started to flicker more frequently, and sometimes, in those flickers, I caught glimpses of movement, a flash of what appeared to be a heel turning a corner, or the swish of a jacket's tail disappearing around the bend. Each time, I would feel an icy spike of fear run through my chest. One night, it escalated in a way that felt like a tipping point. I was lying in bed, trying my hardest to drift off despite the unease coiling in my stomach, when I heard the footsteps again. Slower this time, more pronounced. They stopped right outside my door. My throat went dry and I could barely swallow. My heart pounded hard enough for me to hear my own pulse. Summoning courage from who knows where, I jumped out of bed and yanked the door open. The overhead light in the corridor was weak, pulsing a dull yellowish glow. And standing there, in the middle of the hallway, was a man I had never seen before. He was dressed in an outdated suit, a dark jacket with lapels that looked decades out of style, and a hat with a wide brim. His face was pale and thin, like a faded portrait in an antique photo. The strangest thing was his translucence. I could see the outline of his figure clearly, yet the details seemed washed out, as though all color had been leached from him. There was an eerie glow to him, barely perceptible, making him look like a living grayscale memory. My body seized with panic. My breathing came in ragged bursts, and a cold sweat broke out along my forehead. As I stood there in stupefied terror, the man began to extend a hand toward me. Every hair on my arms and neck rose in alarm. The temperature around me plummeted. I could see my breath form a mist in front of my face. For an instant, my teeth chattered, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. But my feet refused to move. I watched, paralyzed, as his hand inched closer, as if he was reaching out to me or trying to grasp something just beyond my chest. My heart thundered against my ribcage. The moment I blinked, he vanished. It was as if he had never been there, except the cold lingered, seeping into my bones. I stumbled backward, shutting the door with a trembling hand. My mind spun with an onslaught of questions. Had I really seen that? Or was this some trick of my overtired, anxious brain? The chill in the air felt very real, though, and there was nothing imaginary about my ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. The next morning, I confronted the landlord in the kitchen upstairs, my voice shaky despite trying to keep calm. I was careful to speak indirectly, not wanting to sound like I was accusing him of anything, or worse, that I was losing my mind. He seemed oddly unsurprised. He mentioned that strange things had been rumored to happen in the house for decades. According to him, the family who once owned it collected not only typical antiques, but also items rumored to be cursed or possessed. He shrugged and suggested that maybe some presence was still attached to the building. I felt a swirl of nausea in my gut, part fear, part anger. How could he have rented me the basement without warning me of any of this? From that point on, my focus became survival until my lease ended. Every day I kept myself out of the apartment as much as possible, staying late at work or taking walks around the neighborhood. But inevitably, I had to return, and each night brought fresh horrors. Never anything as dramatic as that full apparition in the corridor, but little events that chipped away at my sanity. Once I walked into my living area and found an odd, dusty handprint on the side of my sofa, the shape contorted as if the hand that made it wasn't quite human. Another time, I woke in the early hours of the morning to find the overhead light in the corridor already on, flickering. I had been certain I turned it off before bed. My physical reactions became harder to control. My hands shook uncontrollably whenever I approached the door. My breathing was shallow, and sweat beaded on my upper lip. I started seeing shadows move along the walls out of the corner of my eye. Then, in a moment of quiet, I would turn, and nothing would be there. My mind was in a constant state of hyper-alertness. My ears picked up every creak, every shift in temperature, every faint breath of wind from the cracks around the windows. At times, the terror felt almost suffocating, like a weighted blanket pressing down on my chest. I lost weight, as my appetite was nearly non-existent. Sleeping pills became a necessity just so I could catch a few hours of rest, though they did little to stop the nightmares that haunted me. In those dreams, the man in the antique suit would stand at the edge of my vision, always reaching out, always trying to make me come closer. My sense of reality began to distort. More than once, I questioned if I was just losing touch with my sanity. Could it all be explained by stress, isolation, or maybe even an undiscovered gas leak causing hallucinations? I called in a specialist to check for carbon monoxide or mold, anything tangible to explain the phenomenon. The tests came back normal. No leaks, no toxins, no rational explanation. I was left alone with my unease. When I finally reached the last week of my contract, I was a wreck. My eyes looked hollow, and my nerves were shot. However, I also felt a strange burst of energy each day, knowing I was so close to escape. I packed up my belongings as soon as I could, stacking boxes in the corner of the living area. I tried my best to ignore the sense that someone was observing every move I made. Whenever that cold, crawling sensation slid along the back of my neck, I forced myself to keep boxing up my things, refusing to look over my shoulder. On my final night in that apartment, I half expected an all-out assault from whatever lurked in those corridors, but instead, there was a hushed, almost charged silence. I remember lying on my mattress. My bed frame had already been disassembled, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep. The silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Hours passed, and my eyelids grew heavy. Then, in the stillness, I heard it. A single footstep in the hallway, so close it might have been right behind the door. My pulse raced. I held my breath. The doorknob never turned, and no further footsteps followed. It was just that one deliberate sound. When morning light finally crept in through the small windows near the ceiling of the basement, I sprang out of bed with a determination fueled by dread. The landlord stopped by to ask when I'd be handing over the keys. I told him indirectly that I was leaving as soon as my van was packed. He gave me a half-hearted nod, as if he knew why but didn't dare say it aloud. I felt a final shiver as I locked the door for the last time, that sense of being watched intensifying until I climbed the stairs and closed the basement door behind me. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that once I left the property I never felt that presence again. But the truth is more unsettling. Even in my new place, a modern building with bright lighting and no antiquated corners, there are moments late at night when the air grows suddenly cold. I'll hear a soft creaking sound, like a floorboard under slow, cautious steps. Then I look around, heart pounding, and see only my furniture, my walls, my own reflection in the windows. Yet the memory of that colorless face lingers. Sometimes I catch myself expecting to see a phantom silhouette in the corner. My pulse will spike, and my throat goes dry, reminding me of those basement nights all over again. In the end, there were no dramatic confrontations, no injuries or headlines. The true horror was in the slow, gnawing dread that took hold of me during those weeks and never quite let go. I escaped the basement when my contract ended, but I carry the experience like a specter in my mind. There's a lesson buried somewhere in that ordeal. Perhaps that some places hold on to the energies of their past, refusing to let them fade away. Or maybe it's a warning that certain artifacts, certain histories, leave a mark no amount of new paint or renovation can cover up. Even now, just recounting the events sends a chill through my spine, and my body tenses as I recall that reaching, ghostly hand. The memory is so vivid that I sometimes question how I managed to convince myself to stay as long as I did. I suppose I clung to my rational side, believing I could push through if I just held on a little longer. But that rational side took a severe beating in that house. It's over. I remind myself of that fact whenever the old terror resurfaces. I'm no longer in that cold, dim corridor, facing a figure that shouldn't exist. I've left the musty odor, the flickering lights, and the unnerving silences behind. Yet the imprint remains, buried in my senses, surfacing in the darkest hours. I suppose that's the real haunting. Not the figure in the suit, but the enduring fear that reality is less stable than I once believed. That, at any time, a door might open in the middle of the night and reveal something I can't fully explain, reaching out with a terrible, bone-chilling cold. Though I got out, I can't escape the knowledge that these things, these presences, might still be there, lurking in places just beyond ordinary sight. And the scariest part is how easily we can stumble into them, drawn by a cheap rent in an old house or the promise of a quaint living space. In the wake of it all, I can only say this. If you ever feel a cold hand on your shoulder when you're alone in a dark hallway, think carefully before you turn around. Some things once seen can never truly be unseen. I remember the exact moment the atmosphere in that old inn shifted. 1 second, the corridor outside my room was still and silent. The next, a sudden gust of cold air carried the faint sound of something heavy scraping against wood. My heart lurched at the noise, and every hair on my arm stood on end. That was how it always seemed to start. A subtle disturbance in the silence, a chill that seemed to rise up from the floorboards, and the overwhelming sense that something was dreadfully wrong. I had arrived at the inn only a few days earlier, seeking a quiet place to stay while I looked into some property a few miles away. The building was old, a 2-story structure with a sagging roof, pale gray walls that might have once been white, and a walkway lined with chipped stones that led to an ornate wooden door. The owner had explained, in a dry tone, that the inn was over a century old, refurbished here and there. The moment I crossed the threshold, I noticed the stale smell of old carpets and dusty drapery, tinged with something vaguely medicinal, as though the place had once been used for more than just lodging. My room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that curved around the main staircase. The lights were few and far between, often flickering or simply too dim. It was always a challenge finding the right key at night when the only illumination came from a single yellow bulb in the ceiling. What caught my attention the very first evening was how cold the hallway was, particularly near the bathroom at the far end. Even when I asked the innkeeper if the heating was on, he only shrugged and said the building's insulation wasn't great, but insisted the rooms themselves stayed warm enough. I tried not to dwell on it, but each night I found myself becoming increasingly sensitive to that drop in temperature, as though the corridor itself was breathing an icy breath onto the back of my neck. On my second night, I was stirred awake around 2 a.m. by a loud slam. My heart instantly pounded against my rib cage, and my palms started sweating. For a moment, I wondered if there had been an accident on the stairs, or if someone had collapsed against a door. When I got up and gingerly opened my own door, I heard another bang echo from the far end of the corridor. It sounded like the bathroom door being forcefully closed. I tried to rationalize. It could be just the wind, or a draft from an open window. My breath came in quick bursts as I stepped into the hallway, barefoot on the freezing wooden floor. I approached the bathroom door and saw it was firmly shut. The corridor was eerily still again. The silence was somehow even more unsettling than the banging had been. The next morning, after a restless night, I told the owner about the noise. He gave me a dismissive glance, mumbled something about the old frames expanding and contracting in the cold, and changed the subject. His casual attitude didn't exactly reassure me, but I tried to convince myself he was right. Old buildings made strange noises. I tried to focus on my daytime tasks, but I kept recalling the distinct force behind that door slamming. It hadn't been gentle, like a draft. It was as though someone, or something, had thrown every ounce of strength into closing it. Another day passed without incident, although the atmosphere around the bathroom corridor still felt disturbingly cold. That night, the door started banging again. This time, I forced myself to stay in bed and not investigate. My heart hammered in my chest, and sweat trickled down my temple, even as the rest of me felt chilled to the bone. The floor creaked outside my room as if someone were shuffling past, and I held my breath, praying the footsteps would continue down the stairs or toward the main entrance. Instead, they stopped right in front of my door. I felt a sudden jolt of panic as I waited, motionless, for what might come next. Nothing happened. No knocks. No further steps. Just an oppressive silence that weighed on me until I could finally drift back into a fitful sleep. By the time the third night rolled around, I was exhausted and on edge. I told myself I'd investigate thoroughly, because living in that constant state of uncertainty was driving me mad. My logic was simple. If I could prove to myself it was merely a strong gust or some warped piece of wood, maybe I'd sleep better. It was nearing 1 a.m. when I heard the first loud thud resonate through the walls. I swallowed the lump in my throat, adrenaline already coursing through my veins. My hands were trembling, and my mouth felt parched as I left my room. The hallway was dimly lit by a single overhead light. The musty smell of the carpet seemed more pungent than usual, and my heart thudded so loudly I feared I might wake any other guests just by standing there. The bathroom door was closed when I approached. My breath was shallow, my chest tightening with every step I took. A sense of dread clung to me, as though something intangible wanted to push me back into my room. But I continued forward. I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was freezing. My fingers almost jerked away from the shock of the cold metal, but I managed to keep hold. Then, a sudden slam came from the other side, and the door rattled so violently, I felt its vibration travel up my arm. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled my hand away, heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. The door settled for a moment, but I felt a heavy presence there, as though something was looming just behind the wood. In a moment of desperate resolve, I grabbed the doorknob again, this time determined to hold it fast. If it was the wind, I reasoned, I'd be able to feel the pressure shift. But the moment my grip tightened, a colossal force nearly yanked the knob out of my hand. The suddenness made me gasp, my entire body tensing as I fought to keep it steady. A horrifying growl, or perhaps a low, rasping hiss, emanated from within, and I could feel the vibrations of that unearthly sound course through my fingers. My blood went ice cold, my legs trembling so violently I had to brace myself against the wall with my free hand. Panic flooded my mind, urging me to let go, urging me to run back to my room, lock the door, and never leave again. But a sliver of desperate curiosity kept me holding on. Then the pressure intensified, and the doorknob twisted violently in my grip. I lost control of my own hand, my fingers slipping as if the metal itself had turned slick. I let go in reflex, stumbling backward with a startled cry. The instant my hand left the knob, the door slammed shut with such force that I expected the entire frame to splinter. The sound boomed through the corridor, leaving a painful ringing in my ears. My chest was heaving by the time I regained my balance, cold sweat trickling down my back. There was no mistaking it now. Something was in there, something far more powerful than a mere draft. I fled to my room without hesitation, locking the door behind me and pressing my ear to the wood, my lungs burning with each rapid breath. Silence followed, almost mocking in its stillness. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with impossible explanations. Was I hallucinating, my senses sharpened by exhaustion and paranoia? Or was there truly a presence occupying that bathroom? The idea of a supernatural entity seemed absurd, but the sheer force I'd felt on that knob was undeniable. At certain moments, my own rational mind insisted I must have been half asleep and conjured that growl. Yet my shaking limbs and the vivid recollection of that intense slam told a different story. The following morning, I resolved to check the bathroom. Perhaps I would discover some mechanical trick or see evidence of rotted wood letting in a draft. My gut churned as I approached, but the daylight that streamed through the corridor windows lent me a small measure of bravery. As I neared the door, I noticed deep grooves on the wood, long scratches that looked disturbingly like claw marks. I knelt down for a closer look, and sure enough, I saw 5 elongated channels carved into the surface, as though made by impossibly long fingers. The sight almost made me sick. My heart thundered so fiercely I felt lightheaded. This wasn't just the product of an old door warping in the cold. Something had left visible signs of violence right there on the wood. I walked away from the bathroom and headed downstairs, my mind in a haze of disbelief and terror. I tried hinting to the innkeeper that the corridor was far colder than anywhere else, that odd noises kept me awake, and that there were some alarming scratches on the bathroom door. He offered no more than a casual remark about how those marks had always been there, that guests had complained about them from time to time, and that he simply repainted the wood occasionally to keep them from looking too unsightly. The conversation left me with a profound sense of helplessness. It was as if the place had some unspoken arrangement with its occupant, and everyone else just shrugged it off. That day, I avoided my room as much as possible. I lingered in the main lobby, which was marginally warmer and filled with antiques that rattled every time someone walked across the creaky floorboards. I glanced at the wide windows, noticing how the sunlight fell into the space, revealing floating dust motes and worn patterns in the threadbare rugs. I kept replaying the events of the previous night, heart pounding each time I recalled that monstrous growl. I felt trapped in a waking nightmare, unsure of whether I should pack up and leave immediately, or force myself to endure a final night to see if I could gather more information. That evening, as the sun began to sink behind the western hills, I caught a glimpse of the corridor from the base of the stairs. The hallway looked darker than ever, the lone bulb flickering as if it were struggling to stay lit. My mouth went dry, a feeling of dread swirling in my gut. I wanted to flee, but a perverse curiosity drew me back up those creaking steps. My head buzzed with the question, what if the cause was rational after all? What if I had let superstition and fear twist an ordinary situation into a grotesque fantasy? Despite the swirling thoughts, my body was trembling by the time I stood in front of my door. I could see the bathroom door at the end of the corridor, partially ajar, and no lights were turned on inside. My chest tightened, and my palms felt clammy as I inserted my key into the lock. Once inside, I flicked on the overhead light and tried to compose myself. Every muscle in my body remained tense, as if expecting the door to slam at any second. Minutes stretched by, and nothing happened. Eventually, feeling too wired to sleep but too tired to think straight, I sat on the edge of the bed. The bedding felt suffocatingly warm, contrasting with the icy draft around the edges of the room. I noticed that same medicinal odor hovering near the door, stronger than before, making me dizzy. My breath became shallow, and my heart stuttered in my chest. Yet exhaustion won out for a moment, and I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by a faint scratching noise. It was coming from the corridor, from somewhere near that bathroom. My heart drummed in my ears as I stood up. The scratching sound persisted, slow and deliberate, like nails scraping across wood. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I cracked open my door an inch, peering into the hallway. It was difficult to see anything in the weak light, but the sound was definitely originating near the bathroom. The corridor was freezing, the chill hitting me like a physical force. I strained my eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of any motion, but the hallway was empty, except for that half-open bathroom door. I felt compelled to step forward, as though being pulled by an invisible thread. My mind screamed at me to stop, to get out of that inn and never return. But my feet carried me onward. Each step seemed louder than thunder in the stillness, and with every creak of the floorboards, my heart leapt into my throat. When I reached the bathroom, I hesitated just inches from the threshold, that oppressive cold intensifying until my breaths came out in trembling gasps. I stared at the door, Those claw-like scratches looked even deeper now, and the doorknob was again turned slightly, as though someone's hand rested on the other side. My own hand quivered as I reached for it. I couldn't help imagining whatever was within might suddenly yank the door wide open and drag me inside. But before I could summon the courage to touch the knob, an overwhelming sense of danger overcame me, and I found myself stumbling backward. A paralyzing dread gripped my entire body. I tore my gaze away from the door and back down the corridor. My heart was pounding so violently, I wondered if it might give out. Each ragged breath felt like shards of ice cutting my throat. In a frenetic burst of fear, I spun and rushed into my room, slamming the door behind me. I secured every lock, then threw myself against the door, my heart nearly exploding with panic. My mind reeled with horrifying possibilities, but I knew I had to escape. That night I packed my things with shaking hands. Every shadow in the room seemed to coil and shift, as if the gloom itself possessed eyes. My vision swam with each flickering movement. I paced until the first rays of dawn cut through the tiny window. The moment I heard the distant voices of someone in the lobby, I grabbed my luggage and bolted from that room, refusing to glance at the bathroom or the corridor behind me. My footsteps echoed ominously on the staircase as I descended. I left my key at the front desk, not bothering with explanations. My mind was a relentless cacophony of pounding fear and half-formed thoughts. I might have mumbled something about an emergency to the owner, or perhaps I didn't say anything at all. I honestly can't remember. The important part was leaving that place before something worse happened. Stepping outside, I inhaled the cool morning air, feeling it fill my lungs with a sense of freedom. Yet, even as I closed the car door, an unsettling shiver coursed down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lurked behind that bathroom door had somehow latched onto me, trailing unseen in my wake. I still feel its cold presence whenever I think about the nights I spent in that inn. Sometimes, when a door in my own home creaks or slams unexpectedly, I'm seized by a flash of terror, expecting to see those jagged marks scarring the inside. It's a reminder that some places, and perhaps some forces, are best left alone. Although I escaped physically unscathed, that old corridor at the end of the second-floor landing remains etched in my nightmares. The memory of those claw-like scratches, the freezing doorknob, and that eerie growl return whenever the nights are too silent, and the air feels too still. Even now, I can't say with certainty what I encountered. All I know is that I've never been the same since, and something in that hallway might still be slamming doors, waiting for the next guest to question the difference between a draft and a nightmare in the dead of night. I could feel something wrong from the moment I stepped onto the third-floor corridor that first night. The building was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant mechanical buzz from the air conditioning vents. Yet somehow the silence itself felt loud. There was a pressure in the air, as if the darkness had weight and density, pressing against my ribs and tightening around my lungs. My heart thudded faster than I cared to admit, and I found myself unwilling to glance behind me. It was like I already knew I was being watched, sensed by something that existed in the periphery of my vision and the edge of my consciousness. And it wanted me to look back, to acknowledge that I wasn't alone. I refused. Instead, I marched forward, knuckles white around my flashlight, heart hammering away with a nervous tempo. That was the first clue that my routine nights would never feel the same again. I work as a night security guard in this commercial building, a modern structure with pristine marble floors in the lobby, tinted glass doors, and a grand looming facade that brags about corporate success. During the day, it bustles with the energy of professionals walking swiftly through the halls, making calls, greeting each other with forced smiles. At night, it's my domain. Or at least that's what I used to think. My shift starts at 10 in the evening and runs until 6 in the morning. And for the most part, the job is straightforward. I clock in, make rounds every couple of hours, monitor security footage, and occasionally chase out any stray individuals who've lingered too long. It's lonely work, but I've never minded solitude, until those nights when everything shifted. The first couple of nights around midnight, I heard something that didn't fit the usual pattern of mechanical clangs or echoing footsteps. It was a series of muffled laughs, as if multiple voices were sharing some private joke just a few paces away. At first, I wondered if perhaps cleaning staff had stayed longer than usual, or if some late-night employees were still in the building. But the moment I approached the corridor on the third floor, the laughter faded. Not gradually, like people trying to stifle their amusement, but instantly, like an audio track cut off. Each time I tried to pinpoint where it came from, all I found were deserted hallways and locked office doors. The lights remained dim, the air unnaturally still. I could feel the hair on my arms rise as I swept my flashlight over the walls, blank, white, and cold as a hospital ward. From then on, the laughter returned consistently, as if on schedule. It always started a few minutes before midnight, echoing through the corridors with a strange, distant quality. Each instance felt surreal. Sometimes it was a single, low chuckle. Other times it was a group of voices overlapping in mischievous glee. I grew more and more unsettled as the nights went on. My body responded with a primal wariness, making my pulse jump at every unexpected sound. An air vent turning on or a distant elevator ding. My breath would catch in my throat, and I often found myself standing dead still, ears straining to confirm that I'd really heard laughter, that I wasn't imagining the whole thing. But it happened again and again, enough times that I could no longer chalk it up to exhaustion. One night, I decided I needed evidence, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I turned on my phone's voice recorder before heading to the third floor. I felt my fingers trembling around the device, slick with sweat even though the building's interior was climate-controlled. The corridor lights flickered at the far end, revealing a short stretch of gloom between islands of fluorescent glow. As I walked, the laughter started again, that same muffled quality, as if the walls themselves were trying to contain it. My skin prickled, and my heart began pounding like a drum. I muttered under my breath that if this was some prank, it was about to end. But deep down, I sensed it was far more sinister than a harmless joke. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, the laughter ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence. I strained to hear anything, footsteps, whispers, even breathing, but there was nothing except the hum of the lights. I replayed the audio on my phone, only to hear my own breathing, increasingly ragged and a few faint static pops. No trace of the laughter I had so clearly experienced with my own ears. That's when I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck, like someone was exhaling cold air directly onto my skin. My muscles tensed, and it felt as if my blood froze in my veins. I spun around, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the empty corridor. The overhead lights continued their indifferent flicker, revealing nothing. I was utterly, disturbingly, alone. There was another incident a few days later that escalated everything. It was slightly past midnight, and I was doing a routine patrol on the ground floor. I remembered I had left my jacket near the security desk, so I headed back to retrieve it. As I turned the corner, I caught a faint reflection in the glass entrance doors, a distorted shape behind me. It looked vaguely human but elongated, with edges that seemed to blur as if the reflection were out of focus. My heart rate doubled in an instant. I whipped around, but once again the hallway was deserted. The reflection had vanished. I was left with a cold sweat that beaded on my forehead and dripped into my eyes, stinging with salt. My hands shook uncontrollably. I returned to my desk, trying to ground myself, telling myself I was only overtired, that my mind was playing tricks. Yet the building wouldn't let me rest. My sense of paranoia kept escalating. Doors that had been locked turned up inexplicably ajar. Lights that should remain on went dark for seconds at a time, only to flicker back with no power surge or recorded malfunction. Security cameras didn't catch anything unusual, at least nothing that I could confirm. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed a shadow moving in the corner of the third-floor video feed, but when I replayed it, there was only static. I felt like a prisoner in an ever-tightening snare, every sense heightened and raw, expecting the next attack at any moment. I tried confiding in a coworker who handles the early morning shift. He laughed it off initially, suggesting I might be overthinking the natural sounds of the building at night. He said he had never heard anything unusual, never felt so much as a cold draft outside the norm of air conditioning fluctuations. Still, I pressed him to check the third floor. He shrugged and said he would, but never seemed to find any reason for alarm. He reported back with a casual attitude, remarking that I might need a break, some proper sleep. That stung, because I was sleeping just fine until these events started unfolding. And every time I returned to the building, the mere act of passing the threshold made my stomach clench, as if I were stepping onto cursed ground. The nightmares began creeping into my daytime rest. I would close my eyes and dream of endless corridors with flickering lights, of hearing that same muffled chorus of laughter echo behind every turn. In these dreams, no matter how fast I ran, I never got any closer to the source of the sound. It remained perpetually just out of reach, leading me deeper into twisting hallways. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around my legs, heart pounding like a jackhammer. My nerves were on edge throughout the day, and small sudden sounds, like a cell phone buzzing or a doorbell ringing, made me jump. I recognized I was unraveling but felt unable to stop the descent. Everything climaxed in a single night that still knots my stomach whenever I recall it. I arrived for my shift, nerves taut as piano wire. The manager on duty had left a note about an upcoming maintenance check. It felt reassuring to think actual people would be in the building soon, especially since I was starting to feel like I was the only living soul there after midnight. I found myself counting the minutes, looking forward to any sign of normal company. As the clock crept toward 12, I felt a sick anticipation coil in my gut. My breathing grew ragged and shallow, and my heart hammered as if it wanted to break free from my chest. Sure enough, at midnight, the laughter erupted. Multiple voices, echoing and bouncing off the walls. I felt my scalp tingle, and a wave of goosebumps spread over my arms. The sound wasn't faint this time. It was crisp, almost mocking. I could sense its direction, coming from the far end of the third-floor hallway. I told myself I had to confront it, had to prove this was a hallucination or a trick. My legs felt like lead as I took the stairs, the echo of my own footsteps sounding louder and more ominous than ever. By the time I reached the third floor, the corridor lights were oddly dim, as if the bulbs had lost half their power. Every step I took forward, the laughter receded deeper into the hallway, luring me onward. Eventually, I reached a section with burned-out lights. My flashlight became the only source of illumination, revealing dust particles spinning through the air. I felt that cold breath again, brushing against my ear. My body went rigid, breath caught in my throat. There was no one in sight, but I could hear soft whispering now, indecipherable words spoken in a low, rasping voice. My skin felt clammy, and the flashlight trembled in my grip. I forced myself to shine the beam in the direction of the whisper, and for a fleeting second, the light reflected off something in the corner, something that glimmered like a pair of eyes. Then the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I remember stepping back, every instinct screaming for me to run, but I couldn't. My feet refused to obey, as though the floor had melted around them. My stomach felt as if it had turned to acid. A faint scratch echoed against the walls, as though fingernails were dragging lightly along the surface just behind me. I whipped around, aiming the flashlight, finding nothing but bare wall. My breathing was so loud it roared in my ears. I noticed a slow, scraping sound coming from the ceiling. I angled the beam upward, expecting to see a rodent or a loose ceiling tile. The entire ceiling panel was pristine, yet the scratching persisted for another few seconds before stopping without explanation. I managed to tear myself away and sprint back to the stairwell, my heart racing so fiercely that I was sure I could collapse at any second. My lungs burned, my legs shook, and my mouth felt parched, as if I had swallowed dust. Once I reached the safety of the ground floor, I sank into the chair at the security desk, desperately trying to steady my trembling hands. My mind reeled. It was an all-consuming fear, a suffocating dread that seemed impossible to shake off. My shift ended in 2 hours, and I spent most of that time locked in the security room, eyes darting to the monitors every few seconds, certain I'd see something slithering across one of the corridors, but I never did. After that, I began avoiding the third floor entirely. If my rounds called for me to check it, I'd do so half-heartedly, standing only at the edge of the stairwell, shining a flashlight into the hallway for a cursory glance. Every time, my stomach lurched with the anticipation that I would see a distorted shape waiting for me, or hear that sinister laughter echoing along the walls. The mere idea of stepping foot in that corridor again made my heart pound painfully against my ribs. My breath would go ragged. Cold sweat would trickle down my back. It felt like the building itself was feeding on my terror, that my dread made whatever lurked there stronger. Last night marked the final straw. I heard a faint giggling precisely at midnight, but it sounded closer than ever, not confined to the hallway anymore. I was on the second floor, finishing my rounds, and the laughter emanated from the stairwell behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears and I froze, trying to steady the flashlight. The laughter, playful and mocking, inched nearer, until it felt like it was just over my shoulder. My entire body clenched, a wave of nausea sweeping through me. Then came that same cold breath along my neck, followed by a whisper so close it might have grazed my skin. My limbs were paralyzed, my lungs refusing to inflate. Time seemed suspended. When I finally managed to turn, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the stale air of the stairwell. That was enough. I fled to the lobby, spent the rest of my shift pacing near the doors, refusing to glance back down any corridor. I kept telling myself it was only one more hour until the next guard arrived. My mind raced with questions. Was this building haunted, or was I succumbing to paranoia? Was there something from another realm feeding on my fear? I realized I might never truly uncover the source. Yet the more I questioned my sanity, the more certain I felt that what I experienced was real. Too real to be dismissed as a mere trick of an overactive imagination. In the end, I remain here, still employed at this site, because giving in would mean surrendering to whatever presence inhabits those halls. But I have changed my routine. I avoid the third floor altogether after that final chilling whisper. If the manager asks me to check it, I pretend I did. If a coworker inquires about rumors of strange noises, I speak only in vague terms, suggesting old ventilation shafts and faulty electrical lines. Deep down, though, I know the truth. Something in this building relishes my terror, feasts on every shiver and racing heartbeat. It waits patiently in the dark corners, coiling around the edges of my perception, confident it can lure me back into its domain. And maybe it can. Every shift, I feel its pull. Even now, as I sit here writing this account, my chest feels tight. My shoulders remain tense, braced for the next creeping sound, the next abrupt flicker of lights, the next burst of taunting laughter. I can almost feel the coldness behind me, like a breath from another world. My body is drenched in sweat, and my mouth is dry with dread, a tang of fear lingering on my tongue. I close my eyes and exhale slowly, fighting the trembling in my hands. But the sensation persists, a prickling awareness of an unseen observer, a presence that thrives in the hush of midnight. I'm not sure if I'll endure much longer. Maybe tomorrow I'll request a transfer to the day shift, or find a different job. Yet, I can't shake the feeling that whatever dwells here has marked me. If I leave, will it truly remain behind, confined to these corridors? Or will it follow me into my dreams? The question haunts me as much as the laughter. For now, though, this is my story, and the building's story, intertwined in silent corridors and flickering lights. I remain vigilant, refusing to give it more power by showing my fear. At least, that's what I tell myself. All I can do is hope I'm strong enough to stay one step ahead of the laughter that never fails to echo through those walls. And every midnight, I hold my breath, listening. It's never really gone. It's waiting for me. And each time a chill crawls up my spine, reminding me of an undeniable truth. Whatever laughs in the shadows of that third floor isn't human. and it's enjoying every second of my terror. I noticed the first hint of wrongness as I passed the mirror in the corridor, my peripheral vision catching a flicker that didn't align with my own movements. It was a subtle distortion, like a ripple across still water. My heart lurched in my chest, a primal reaction that told me something was off. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, just a trick of the poor lighting or my tired mind playing games. But that split second was enough to send a jolt of cold dread through my veins. That was the moment everything began to unravel, and the apartment I once found so modern and comforting became a maze of reflections I could no longer trust. I've lived in this apartment for almost a year, and one of the reasons I chose it was its sense of spaciousness. The corridors are lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, reflecting light in such a way that it makes the space feel broader than it is. Initially, I liked the aesthetic. It made even the dim evenings feel a bit brighter, but now those mirrored walls only succeed in amplifying the emptiness. On many nights, I walk through the hallways, and it feels like I'm wandering through infinite versions of my own life. I see my figure from all angles, repeated endlessly, as if I'm stuck in some surreal funhouse. It used to be mesmerizing. Now it sets my nerves on edge. The first real sign of something amiss occurred on a Monday right after I got home from work. I was so exhausted that my eyes were almost closing by themselves. I remember tilting my head to one side, massaging my stiff neck with my hand. At that moment, I glimpsed my reflection following the motion, just a microsecond late, yet noticeable. My heart rate spiked. I froze and stared at the mirror, half expecting it to do something else. But my reflection simply stared back, perfectly in sync. I walked away, trying to calm my mounting anxiety. Maybe I'd had a tension headache or a migraine aura. Perhaps I was just that tired. Over the next few days, though, this delay became impossible to ignore. Each time it happened, it was more pronounced. I would bend down to pick something up, and the reflection would pause before mirroring my movement. I felt a mounting pressure in my chest each time I saw it. My reflection's eyes, which should have been my own, took on a vacant, almost mocking expression. Whenever I blinked, I had the eerie sense that it blinked afterward. My breaths became shallow each time I passed those corridors, to the point that I tried to avoid looking at the mirrors altogether. But in an apartment dominated by reflective surfaces, that became nearly impossible. I told myself it was all in my mind. Maybe the stress of my job was reaching an all-time high. I had a vague recollection of an article I read about Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where perception of one's reflection could distort under extreme stress. Or perhaps it was just the poor lighting combined with eye strain. Each night I lay in bed, chest heaving with ragged breaths, struggling to compose myself before drifting into a restless sleep. The next morning I'd wake up, hope the phenomenon had vanished, and then walk down the hallway, heart thudding, only to confirm that the delay had grown worse. Eventually I tried to talk to someone about it, casually, indirectly. I hinted that I was seeing strange things at home, that maybe the mirrors in my apartment were producing illusions. The acquaintance, noticing my agitation, suggested I get more rest. They mentioned that stress could cause all sorts of perceptual glitches. While they were gentle about it, I could sense disbelief in their tone, as though I were exaggerating. I didn't push the topic further. Weeks passed, and the tension in my chest became a daily companion. My appetite dwindled. I felt a near-constant headache throbbing at the base of my skull, as if my mind was forcing me to acknowledge something I'd rather deny. The corridor mirrors weren't just delayed anymore. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection staring at me even after I had turned my head away. It was like a movie frozen on a single frame, that face with eyes that were mine but not mine, as though it was analyzing me from the other side of the glass. Every time it happened, a chill crawled across my scalp, and sweat prickled at the back of my neck. Some nights I'd wake to a faint noise in the hallway. It sounded like a soft scraping, or the slightest shuffle of feet. I'd lie very still in bed, heart hammering, straining to hear if there were further sounds. My ears would ring from the intensity of my own pulse. Once or twice I forced myself to get up, body trembling with dread, to check the corridor. I'd find nothing, just my reflection in the dark mirror, faintly illuminated by the glow of a nearby street lamp. Yet in that dim flicker of light, I could swear my reflection's chest didn't rise and fall in time with mine. I'd exhale, watch my breath condense on the cold surface, and see no breath from the figure opposite me. Things escalated on a particularly stormy night. The wind rattled my windows, and distant thunder growled across the sky. I tried to distract myself by reading, but each time lightning flashed, I saw my own silhouette flicker in the corridor mirror. The first time I got up to investigate, I noticed my reflection's posture looked off. My shoulders were slightly hunched in the mirror, even though I was standing upright. My palms felt clammy, and my stomach tightened. When I retreated back to the bedroom, I left the lights on. I hoped that keeping the apartment well lit would dispel whatever illusions were haunting me. The final straw came during a sleepless night. I'd been tossing and turning, my mind refusing to shut off. A pang of discomfort in my chest made me realize I was practically holding my breath. I got up, deciding that maybe a walk around the apartment would help me clear my head. As I passed the corridor mirror, I didn't even intend to look, but some movement caught my eye, and I turned my head. That's when I saw it happen. My reflection, in a single horrifying moment, moved independently of me. It raised an arm, one finger extended, pointing directly at me. My breath turned into a painful gasp, my lungs squeezing in panic. Then, just as fast, it resumed its usual posture, mirroring my stance as though nothing had happened. I stood there trembling, sweat running in cold beads down my forehead and along my back. My heart felt like it was pounding against my ribcage, trying to break free. In that instant, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. It was an animalistic surge of terror that made my muscles tense and my vision tunnel. I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the mirror, half expecting my reflection to move again. But it remained still, wearing my wide-eyed look of panic. All I could hear was the drumming of my pulse in my ears and the soft hiss of my own ragged breathing. That moment shattered any rationalization I had left. I could no longer tell myself it was a mere trick of the light or a byproduct of stress. Something lurked in those mirrors, something that had worn my face like a mask, mocking me with subtle delays. Now it had shown me it could act on its own volition. I felt exposed, as though the walls themselves were sentient and pressing in on me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my living room couch, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, watching the corridors from a distance. Every so often I thought I glimpsed the reflection shift in that large mirror, but I had no way to be certain in the dim glow of the small lamp I'd left on. I clutched my chest, feeling my heartbeat thunder against my palm. My mouth was so dry that each swallow felt like sandpaper. In the following days, I avoided going home until late at night, preferring the company of fluorescent lights in all-night diners or the blank stares of people on the last subway trains. I'd nurse a cup of coffee, though my nerves were so frayed that the caffeine did me no favors. My hands shook to the point that I struggled to hold the mug without spilling. One evening, I overheard someone mention how illusions can stem from the subconscious, and I briefly wondered if this was all some manifestation of deep anxiety. But then I'd remember the reflection pointing at me, moving like a puppet that had briefly cut its strings, and the logic fell apart. When I finally did enter my apartment, I made sure to switch on every light and keep my eyes fixed on the floor. The air inside felt stale, as if the place had been holding its breath while waiting for me. My gut twisted with apprehension, and an unsettled weight pressed down on me. I could sense the mirrors in the corridors, sense the silent presence behind them. My reflection had become something other, something separate from me, and I dreaded meeting its gaze. Each time I had to pass the corridor, I tried to remind myself to stay calm, to keep my breathing steady. It didn't always work. My heart would race, my palms would sweat, and that prickling sensation at the back of my neck would intensify until it felt like someone was standing right behind me. More than once, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half convinced I'd see a figure there, but I'd only find the empty corridor and my reflection's eyes in the mirror. Only, Those eyes sometimes looked more hollow than they should. Eventually, I realized I couldn't live like this. The fear was chewing away at my sanity, making my everyday life impossible. I considered calling a professional, someone who could at least remove the large mirrors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection wanted me to do something. Acknowledge it, confront it, or maybe challenge it. I hesitated because I feared that tampering with the mirrors might make the situation worse, as if it would provoke whatever was lurking there. One evening, I decided to face it head-on. I told myself I would stand before the corridor mirror, stare directly into my own eyes, and see what happened. If my reflection was indeed something else, then I'd meet it. I have no idea if that was bravery or desperation. Probably both. My body felt charged with adrenaline, limbs tight and alert. My skin tingled, and my breaths came in quick, shallow bursts. I switched off all the lights except one small lamp near the corridor, casting a warm but weak glow on the mirror's surface. I stepped in front of it, feet planted firmly on the hardwood floor. My reflection was there, as always, mimicking my posture. I leaned forward slowly, heart pounding, and watched as the reflection leaned a fraction of a second later. This time I held eye contact. I could feel my entire body tense, as if I were on the brink of something irreversible. For the longest moment, we just stared at each other. I became acutely aware of my own rapid breathing, the dryness in my throat, and the sweat collecting on my temples. Then, without warning, I felt a wave of nausea as my reflection's face shifted ever so slightly. It was the same expression, the same eyes, but something behind those eyes flickered. I sensed a faint static buzz in the air, like electricity building up before a storm. My reflection seemed to smirk, or maybe it was just the twist of the light. But it felt deliberate, like it was acknowledging me with an almost triumphant satisfaction. I recall my vision blurring at the edges from the stress. My chest felt tight, and each breath burned with panic. Yet I couldn't look away. Then I heard something. It was neither a whisper nor a voice, more a pressure in my ears, like an unspoken demand. I couldn't identify the words, but it was as if I was being told to accept that this presence was real. My heart hammered in my ribcage, and a tear of absolute terror slid down my cheek. I swallowed hard, forced myself to move back, and in a moment of desperate clarity, I slammed my fist against the mirror. The mirror cracked, shards spiderwebbing out from the point of impact. I stared, chest heaving, as the reflection fractured into a dozen angles of my own face. The realization of what I'd done jolted me. It was like my body had taken control in a frantic attempt at self-preservation. For an instant, a sense of relief washed over me. I had challenged it, broken the hold it had on me. Then I saw the reflection in the largest shard shift one last time, a flicker of movement that didn't match mine. I felt an icy dread swirl in my stomach, but it was too late to undo what I'd done. Now, the corridor stands with a cracked mirror. Splintered pieces remain in the frame, each segment reflecting a distorted piece of me. I've covered the shards with an old sheet. I still hear strange noises at night, a soft scraping, as if something is trying to piece itself back together behind that white fabric. My nerves are still raw, and I haven't fully recovered from the ordeal. Sometimes I think about packing up and leaving, but I don't know if that would help. The sense of being watched hasn't disappeared. My reflection, or whatever it was, might still be with me. If it was a product of my own mind, maybe it's lodged in my subconscious, waiting to reappear in any mirror I come across. On nights when the wind howls and the shadows stretch across the walls, I'm certain I feel a gaze from behind that sheet. My heart pounds until I wonder if I'll pass out. I can't bring myself to remove the cloth. The idea of seeing whatever is left of that reflection chills me to the bone. I still catch my breath whenever I pass by, half expecting a hidden hand to shoot out from beneath the fabric and grab me. If I look at any mirror for too long, at work, in stores, anywhere, I sense a minuscule hesitation in my reflection's eyes. Perhaps I'm just hyper-aware now, spooked by my own recollections. Or maybe, once you crack the boundary between yourself and the other side, That boundary can never be sealed again. I don't know where it all leads from here, but I'm determined to find a way to exist without letting this terror consume me. Every day, I force myself to walk through my home. Each step tests my courage, each reflection in smaller surfaces, like the microwave door or the black screen of my television, makes my heart skip a beat. But I press on. The apartment is still mine, and as much as I dread the corridors, I refuse to surrender entirely to fear. For now, I remain vigilant, scanning reflections out of the corner of my eye. I carry with me the memory of that moment when my reflection pointed at me, and that memory alone is enough to make my skin crawl. The mere thought of it surges a shot of adrenaline through my veins, reminding me that some things can't be explained away by logic or exhaustion. The sheets remain draped over the broken mirror, and a suffocating hush hangs around it. The tension still lingers in the air, like a bruise that refuses to fade. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear a slight shift of glass under the cover. My heart pounds, but I can never quite find the courage to look. Maybe I'll move out one day, or maybe I'll manage to muster the strength to remove that mirror entirely. Until then, all I can do is endure the lingering dread and keep myself from spiraling into madness. I haven't told anyone else about this incident. Not really. Part of me doubts they would believe it. Part of me fears their reactions if they did. So here I am, in this apartment that's both my refuge and my prison. The corridor stands quiet, its mirrors either covered or carefully avoided, but the memories remain. Despite the terror, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the possibility that something may lurk just beyond my reflection. I don't have all the answers, and I can't say for sure if my mind is playing tricks or if something supernatural truly inhabits those glossy surfaces. What I do know is that every time I catch a fleeting delay in any reflection, my pulse skyrockets, and I remember that things aren't always what they seem. The mirrors may stay cracked, but that creeping sense of being watched persists. Perhaps that's the most horrifying truth of all, that once you've witnessed your reflection move on its own, you can never again be certain of what's looking back at you. The first time I realized something was wrong, I was driving my old delivery van along that lonely country road, watching the sun dip behind the field of sunflowers on my left. The sky was streaked with purple and orange, but the fading light didn't feel comforting. It felt claustrophobic, like someone slowly turning a dimmer switch in a cramped room. From the corner of my eye, I saw silhouettes in the field shift in ways that defied logic, like tall, slender figures bending in unison with no wind to drive their movement. Even with my windows rolled up, I could have sworn I heard a faint rustling that resembled whispers. I make deliveries in rural regions for a living, a job that requires me to traverse desolate roads and remote properties. For the most part, I enjoy the solitude. There's a meditative quality to the endless stretches of farmland. But that sunflower field, something about it has always made me uneasy. Maybe it's the way the large, bright heads seem to stare right at you as you pass, or how they stand in rigid rows, forming a natural wall that blocks out what lies beyond. If you tried to see past them, you'd find only pitch darkness after sundown. Every weekday evening I cover the same route, passing that particular field around dusk. Usually I keep my eyes on the road, focusing on the next stop or listening to the engine rumble to make sure it's not about to give out. But over the past few weeks, I noticed the sunflower's shadows on the asphalt seemed to stretch farther than any normal plants should. They snaked across the ground, an inky black tapestry that almost looked like it was crawling. Sometimes the shadows even formed vague human shapes, shoulders and elongated arms swaying in the dying light. I told myself it was just a trick of the eye. After all, I was tired from long hours of driving. My mind was probably playing games with the interplay of light and leaves. Yet the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the images persisted. On the edges of my vision, I saw tall, contorted outlines dance and flicker. My chest would tighten, and my pulse would pound so hard I could hear the thumping in my ears. There were nights when my palms sweated on the steering wheel, making it slippery, forcing me to wipe them on my jeans to keep control of the vehicle. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. As I approached the field, I felt my throat go dry. The sun was nearly gone, leaving a sickly orange glow on the horizon. I pulled over to the shoulder and shut off the engine. The instant quiet was jarring. Normally, when you turn off a van, you might still hear the ticking of the engine cooling, or a distant hum of wind, but this place was so still it felt like the air itself had frozen. My own breathing sounded loud and ragged, as though I'd just sprinted a mile. I stepped out and stood facing the sunflower rows. They appeared ordinary at first glance, tall stalks with broad petals, each plant angled slightly to where the sun had set. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that they were watching me, observing my every move. My heart hammered in my chest, and I took a few tentative steps forward. The crunch of gravel under my boots was nearly deafening in the hush. Then I caught a flicker of motion. A shadow darted somewhere near the center of the field, out of sync with the breeze. Except there was no breeze. My lungs constricted as a wave of cold sweat trickled down my spine. I scanned the area but saw nothing except sunflower heads frozen in place. Just as I was about to turn back to my van, I heard something. It was so soft I thought I might have imagined it. A subdued chortle, like someone stifling laughter. My skin prickled. I remember swallowing hard, my mouth too dry to form words even if I had wanted to call out. I stood perfectly still, listening. The laughter faded into what sounded like murmuring voices. They rose and fell, but I couldn't discern any actual language. It was more like a gentle babble, distant yet disturbingly intimate, as if it were coming from inside my own head. My breathing became shallow. Every exhalation shook my body. I took a step back, and the murmurs intensified for a moment before receding again. My instincts told me to get out of there. My head felt light, and my hands trembled at my sides. I forced myself to approach a single sunflower at the edge of the field. I wanted to inspect it, to prove to myself that it was just a normal plant. When I touched the rough stalk, it was solid enough. The petals were smooth and soft, just as they should be. Still, the sense of being watched never left. I looked down, and for a split second, I thought I saw my shadow entwined with another shape, a tall, angular figure looming behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkening sky. That was enough for one night. I hustled back to my van, heart pounding, footsteps unsteady, as though the ground itself was swaying. Once inside, I locked the doors, an irrational gesture, but it made me feel marginally safer. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, glancing repeatedly in the rearview mirror. In that mirror, I saw hints of movement in the field, like something leaning out from between the rows. The shape dissolved whenever I focused on it, but I was absolutely convinced the shadows were following me, keeping pace until I hit a certain distance. Even then, I could still sense them lingering at the boundary of my vision. Over the next few days, my routine became punctuated by dread. I'd start to sweat in the early afternoon, knowing I'd eventually have to drive past that field at sundown. My hands quivered, and my stomach coiled in knots whenever I thought of stopping there again. But ignoring it only magnified the unease. I tried telling a colleague about it in a roundabout way. He said something dismissive about me working too many hours. His words were practical, urging me to take some time off or get more sleep. I nodded in agreement, but deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined those murmurs or that eerie, bone-deep feeling of being scrutinized. One night, as I approached the field, I decided to turn on my high beams, illuminating the long stalks with harsh white light. For a fraction of a second, I glimpsed shifting figures among the rows. They were slender and elongated, and they recoiled from the light as if it burned them. My heart leaped into my throat, and my foot slammed the brake. When the lights finally stabilized, everything looked normal again, just flowers and leaves. But I couldn't shake the thought that I had briefly seen silhouettes standing upright, their limbs bending in ways that defied human anatomy. I gasped for air, my breath so labored I could feel it scraping my raw throat. It was then that I truly questioned my own sanity. Was I hallucinating from fatigue, or was there something in that field? After that incident, I tried a different route home, one that was longer and required me to endure a winding gravel path full of potholes. But soon enough, my boss noticed the extra gas charges and longer times on my log. He asked me, in an indirect way, whether I was having trouble. I gave a vague answer about construction on the usual road. He didn't believe me, but he let it slide. Yet I knew I couldn't avoid the sunflower field forever. I had deliveries to make, a job to keep. When I returned to the old route, I tried crossing it earlier in the day. That worked a few times, but eventually I got delayed by a late pickup. By the time I was approaching the field, the sky was an unsettling gray, tinged with an impending storm. Rain began to splatter the windshield in fat, heavy drops. I slowed down, peering through the wipers as they smeared water across the glass. The sunflowers appeared darker in the storm's half-light, their once vibrant petals dulled and shrouded in gloom. A clap of thunder shook the van, and lightning streaked across the sky. In that brief flash, I saw the entire field light up like a surreal photograph. The shadows between the rows seemed to multiply, twisting and writhing. Something inside me snapped, and I felt an overwhelming urge to confront whatever was lurking there. My breath was ragged with both fear and a strange determination. I pulled over once again, ignoring the pounding rain, ignoring the tightness in my chest that warned me to flee. Stepping out of the van, I felt the downpour drenching me instantly. The air smelled of wet earth and charged electricity. My boots sank into the soggy ground with every step. The thunder roared overhead, and every crack of lightning revealed fleeting shapes between the stalks. It felt like stepping onto a stage set for a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My heart pounded so ferociously it almost hurt. My fingers trembled so badly that I had to clench my hands into fists to maintain any sense of control. As I moved deeper into the field, the rain slackened slightly, but the gloom thickened. The tall sunflowers loomed on either side, forming corridors that seemed to shift and warp. I couldn't see beyond the next row, and the path behind me was swiftly swallowed by darkness. The murmurs started again, softer now, as if beckoning me forward rather than warning me away. I wiped rain from my face, swallowing a metallic taste in my mouth that might have been blood from biting my lip, or perhaps just the tang of adrenaline. The further I ventured, the more the shapes in my peripheral vision intensified. They flickered in and out of view like living shadows, blending with the stalks and leaves so thoroughly that I questioned whether they were part of the plants or something else entirely. My breath came in short bursts, each inhale feeling like it barely supplied enough oxygen. Cold sweat mingled with the rain, making my clothes cling to my body. Despite the suffocating heat of my own terror, I felt an icy chill seep into my bones. Then I reached a small clearing in the center of the field. The sunflowers here were arranged in a near-perfect ring, leaving an open space roughly 6 feet across. The ground was strangely barren, devoid of any smaller plants or weeds. I stood there, the storm overhead reduced to a distant rumble, as if the eye of the darkness was right above me. The voices were louder, forming a faint chorus that rose and fell in hypnotic waves. My pulse hammered in my ears and my legs threatened to buckle. In the dim light, I thought I saw one of the sunflowers pivot, its head slowly turning to face me. Another movement caught my eye on the opposite side of the clearing. Then another, and another, until it felt like every single flower in that circle was tilting toward me in unison. I felt an invisible weight press on my shoulders, an oppressive force that made me want to drop to my knees. My lungs strained against it, and I wheezed as though the air had thickened into a heavy fog. That was when a bolt of lightning illuminated the clearing again. I saw them, figures carved out of darkness, standing between the sunflower stalks. They were tall and featureless, nothing but silhouettes with elongated limbs. Their heads had no discernible faces, yet I sensed they were grinning. A suffocating terror seized me, and my body trembled. My skin prickled as if thousands of insects crawled beneath it. I don't fully recall making the decision to run, but I did. My feet pounded the muddy ground, slipping and sliding as I barreled out of the clearing. The laughter behind me rose, or maybe it was the wind or my own frantic breathing. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting to my van. My vision blurred with tears and rain. my heart racing so fast it felt on the brink of bursting. Stalks whipped at my arms and face, leaving stinging welts, but I barely registered the pain. When I finally stumbled onto the road, the van's headlights glowed like a beacon. I practically hurled myself inside, slamming the door and fumbling for the ignition. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. The wheels spun in the mud, but I pressed the accelerator until I gained traction. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Through the curtain of rain, the field looked still, just a sea of flowers. But I felt a presence, a legion of eyes or shapes lurking just out of sight. I sped for miles, not easing off the gas until I reached the main highway. Even there, my heart refused to settle. Each passing vehicle's headlights caused me to flinch. Every rustle of wind against the windows made me jolt. I drove in tense silence, drenched and shaking, until I finally parked in front of my home. It took me a long time to shut off the engine, even longer to convince myself that leaving the vehicle was safe. To this day, I'm not entirely certain what I encountered. Part of me insists it was all in my head. Stress, lack of sleep, overactive imagination, a play of light and shadows. But a deeper part of me knows better. Something in that field recognized me, beckoned me, and threatened me all at once. Although I've since altered my delivery route permanently and found an excuse that satisfied my boss, I can't drive through any rural area without feeling a spike of unease. If I so much as glimpse a row of sunflowers, my stomach twists into knots, and I feel an unmistakable prickle at the nape of my neck. I still have nightmares. In them, I'm surrounded by impossibly tall sunflowers that whisper my name. Their shadows detach from the stalks to reach for me, and I'm paralyzed, unable to scream or flee. When I jolt awake, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, the sense of dread lingers like a physical weight on my chest. I keep the lights on in my bedroom now, no matter how high the electric bill climbs. Even as I try to move past it, a question gnaws at me. What if those shadows were more than illusions? The notion sends a chill through me that no amount of light or logic can dispel. I'm not sure I'll ever have a satisfying answer, and maybe that's the true horror of it. The not knowing, the perpetual sense that something unspeakable hides just beyond the comforting glow of day. Every so often, on quiet nights, I find myself replaying that stormy encounter. And in the silence of my living room, I think I hear distant laughter, like static in the walls. I remind myself it's just the pipes or the wind. But a part of me wonders if the shadows have followed me home, clinging to my footsteps, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I can't say for sure. All I know is that some nights I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I see their outlines stretching across my ceiling, flickering out of sight the moment I switch on the lamp. Perhaps I escaped in body, but there's a piece of me they still hold, an intangible part that remains lost in that field, trapped among the twisting shadows. And whenever I think about going back, if only to prove to myself it was all a waking dream, my pulse quickens, and I break into a clammy sweat. Because deep down, I fear that if I ever return, I won't be able to leave a second time. So for now, I lock my doors, keep my windows shut at night, and pray that whatever lurks among those sunflowers stays there. Yet I can't ignore the subtle anxiety humming beneath my skin, the uneasy feeling that the shadows are never really gone. They're just biding their time. I noticed the first change on a Thursday at dawn, just before my morning run. The air felt thick, as though the sunlight filtering through the haze carried with it something unspoken, something that lay coiled in the dirt roads around my house. At that early hour, there were no birds calling, no wind in the trees, only a stillness broken by my own ragged breathing as I stepped outside. My shoes crunched on gravel, but there was no echo, nothing to give me back a reassuring sound of life. It was in that disquieting silence that I realized the old metal road signs, the battered, rust-flecked ones that lined every dirt path for miles, looked different. They seemed to be pointing in another direction. I tried to shake it off at first. Maybe someone from the county road department had come out overnight, or maybe a passing car had bumped the signpost. But as I began my usual route, I counted half a dozen signs that appeared subtly misplaced. All pointed in an odd orientation, not quite random, but not logical either. Each time I passed one, a sense of unease settled deeper into my chest, like a weight pressing down on my ribcage. There was no wind. I remember distinctly how the leaves on the trees hung motionless, and yet each sign stood angled, as if deliberately twisted by a careful hand. I've lived near these dirt roads for years, ever since I decided city life was too claustrophobic. I wanted the quiet of nature, the freedom to step outside and see open skies. But that morning, the openness of the farmland and the tangled network of dusty roads felt oppressive, as though I were being watched by something older than I could comprehend. My chest tightened as I jogged past the last sign before turning back. I felt a jolt of alarm. It, too, was facing a new direction, toward my house. My heart thumped hard enough that I could feel the pulse in my temples, and I forced myself to keep running, telling myself it was all in my head. It had to be a prank or a random coincidence. This road system is obscure enough that locals sometimes like to toy with the signs for fun. That was my best explanation, but I still finished my run uneasy. As the day wore on, I tried to dismiss the whole incident. Work demanded my attention, and I found enough distraction in video calls and spreadsheets to push back the growing sense of anxiety. But the moment I let my mind wander, I saw those rusty signs again in my thoughts, turned unnaturally, as if pointing an invisible arrow straight at me. By nightfall, I decided I would check on the signs again in the morning. If they were still out of place, I'd straighten them myself. No big deal. The next morning, the air felt heavier, the sky overcast with bruised clouds that refused to release any rain. I set out on my run and scanned each intersection for the metallic signposts. They looked exactly the same as the day before, misaligned, angled, some bent at the waist of their posts, and it made my spine tingle. I tried to steady my nerves by focusing on my breathing. Each inhalation sounded too loud in my ears, each exhalation raspy and sharp. Sweat beaded on my forehead even though the temperature was cool. I felt the dryness in my mouth intensify as I approached the sign nearest my home. It too remained twisted to face my front door. I couldn't stand it any longer. I stopped my run right there. My arms trembled as I tried to adjust the sign, gripping the cold metal post. The sign resisted. It felt like the rusted bolts had fused, but when I applied enough force, it turned with a jarring squeal, a shrill scraping that cut through the silence and made my ears ring. Once done, I panted, breath harsh and shallow. My muscles were tense, as if expecting something or someone to come lunging out of the trees. But nothing did. No birds, no neighbors, not even a breeze. I spent the next half hour walking from one post to another, straightening them, ignoring how my hands shook with each new metallic scream the signs emitted. Then I returned home. I was exhausted, yet a part of me felt victorious, as though I'd banished some creeping presence. That night, I fell into a restless sleep, but the following day, it was worse. I emerged in the pre-dawn gloom to find the signs back to their twisted angles, every single one. My pulse quickened, and a faint dizziness made me sway on my feet. The rational part of my mind insisted this was a prank or an odd local custom I'd never heard about. Yet I couldn't shake the primal fear needling at my gut, the insistent notion that these signs were watching me. My breathing grew labored again as I stood there, mouth dry, watching the faint moonlight glint off the battered metal. I heard no wind, no cars. It made no sense. One night I decided I would catch whoever was doing this, if indeed it was a person. I didn't bother sleeping. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and tried to keep the lights low in my living room, so I could watch through the window without drawing attention. Around midnight, I felt a rumble in my stomach, a blend of hunger and anxiety. I stared at the road sign in front of my property, a lonely figure on the edge of the dirt road, illuminated only by a distant street lamp. Hours crawled by like that, and my nerves began to fray. Every creak of the house made my heart skip a beat. My breath turned shallow, and every so often I would wipe cold sweat from my brow. My body was taut, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Yet nothing happened. Suddenly, at around 3 in the morning, I heard the faintest metallic groan. It was so soft I questioned if I imagined it. Slowly, I pushed my window open an inch and listened. The air was utterly still, no rustling leaves, no night insects chirping. But that sound, like metal scraping against metal, drifted through the darkness again. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my throat tightened so much it felt painful to breathe. I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside, half expecting to see someone crouched by the sign. The ground was firm, and my footsteps barely made a sound, though I felt my entire body trembling with tension. Another creak echoed, closer this time, and I swung the beam of light toward the sign. Nothing moved. I exhaled shakily. My hands were slick with sweat, making it harder to keep a firm grip on the flashlight. But the sign had changed position by a fraction. Now it was slightly angled more toward me than before. That single adjustment chilled me to my core. There was no one around, no footprints, no rustling in the brush. Nothing, yet I was sure I'd just seen the sign's angle shift. I stumbled back to my porch, nearly tripping over the steps in my haste. My mind raced with questions that offered no rational answers. Could it be the wind, even though there was none? Could some animal be pushing against it? It seemed impossible. A paranoia began to burrow into my thoughts, the realization that I might be dealing with something I could neither see nor explain. Over the next week, I tried to keep life normal, but I failed. My runs became shorter. My sleep was practically non-existent. The repeated metallic rasp in the dead of night would jolt me awake with heart palpitations and clammy skin. Some nights I refused to look outside at all, too terrified to confirm that the signs were indeed rotating, inch by inch, always pointing back at my house like a row of silent sentinels. My hands shook whenever I poured coffee in the morning. My mind was never at ease, not even for a second. One evening, a neighbor spotted me pacing near the mailbox and asked indirectly if everything was okay, implying I looked tired or stressed. I muttered something about not sleeping well and forced a dismissive laugh. He offered a sympathetic nod but didn't press me. The conversation left me unsettled, as if speaking about it out loud somehow acknowledged that these bizarre events were real, more real than I was ready to accept. Desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I borrowed a trail camera and set it up near the largest sign on the most deserted road. The camera had night vision and a motion sensor. If anything happened, I would have video proof, a logical explanation that might dissolve my growing paranoia. With that plan in place, I felt a flicker of hope. The night I set the camera was eerily quiet. No moon, no stars visible through the low, heavy clouds. The darkness felt tangible, pressing in against my windows. My heart pounded erratically as I tried to sleep, a cold sweat gathering on my temples. I woke up multiple times, convinced I heard that scraping metal, the dreadful squeak that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Each time I got up, I peeked out the window, only to see nothing but stillness and blackness. The sounds played tricks with my mind, twisting my perception, making me question if I was dreaming or awake. By dawn, my nerves were shot, but I rushed to retrieve the camera. I was certain I'd see someone tampering with the signs, but the camera showed only static. No animals, no humans. The only thing I saw was that, at a certain hour, the footage began to flicker with a strange, almost organic distortion. Then the camera feed went blank for exactly 3 minutes before resuming. When it resumed, the sign had changed direction. I replayed that footage for an hour, ignoring the dryness in my throat and the trickle of sweat rolling down my back. It made no sense. My ears rang with the crescendo of my own heartbeat, and I couldn't tell if I was more afraid or furious. Something was toying with me, and I was powerless. In a fit of frustration, I decided to remove one of the signs entirely. Maybe if I took a sign out of the ground, the phenomenon would stop, like removing a link in a chain. That same night, I armed myself with a crowbar and a wrench and trudged out to the largest sign. The sky was dark, but the humidity felt suffocating. My shirt stuck to my back, and each breath felt labored, as if I were breathing through a sponge. My heart thundered so forcefully that I could feel it in my fingertips. When I reached the signpost, I tried to pry it from the ground. It was jammed deeper than I'd expected, as if the roots of the earth were clutching it. The metal post groaned under my effort, letting out that sickening scrape again. The sound reverberated through the still air, raising goosebumps on my arms. My breathing grew ragged and shallow as the sign started to come loose. My hands trembled with a raw, desperate energy. Finally, with a final grunt, the sign tore free from the dirt. For a moment, relief flooded me, followed immediately by a piercing sense of wrongness. I stood there holding that battered, rusted sign, panting in the darkness. The wind picked up for the first time in days, but it felt unnatural. A sudden gust that rattled the surrounding trees, swirling dust into the air. In that swirl of dust, I caught a glimpse of something intangible, like a faint human silhouette that vanished before I could process what I was seeing. Terrified, I stumbled back, sign in hand. My head spun. I tried to steady myself, but my legs felt rubbery. I had the horrible sensation that I was not alone. A faint presence, or maybe a subtle vibration in the earth, seemed to ripple around me. My chest was so tight I could barely inhale, and my skin went cold despite the warm night. I think I whispered something like, "This can't be real," but my own voice sounded distant and foreign to my ears. I sprinted home, adrenaline igniting every muscle in my body. That night, I slept with the sign on my porch, telling myself I would dispose of it in the morning. Yet my sleep was broken by nightmares. I dreamed the sign was thrashing on its own, squealing and turning as though possessed by a malevolent force. Each time I jolted awake, my heart hammered painfully. I felt pinned down by dread, drenched in sweat, my lungs aching for air. By dawn, my plan was to drive the sign to the dump. But when I went out to the porch, the sign was gone. The imprint on the wooden planks was there, but the metal shape had disappeared without a trace. I was left with nothing but a faint outline in the layer of dust where it had lain. My arms and legs began to quake, and a wave of nausea surged through me. I couldn't decide if I was more furious at the intrusion or absolutely petrified by the impossibility of it all. I took the rest of that day off from work, convinced I had to do something drastic. Maybe leaving entirely was the answer, at least for a while. I packed a bag, threw it in my trunk, and resolved to drive far enough away that I wouldn't sense this ominous presence. As I turned onto the main road, I passed those remaining signs, each angled in that eerie, deliberate way. Every single one pointed toward my house, as though to say, "We know where you live. You can't hide." My breath came in shallow gasps, and my palms slicked the steering wheel. I felt a tingling in my chest, a near panic that threatened to clamp down on my lungs. The farther I drove, the more I sensed some intangible cord stretching between me and the signs, as if they were watching my departure with a silent, dreadful patience. Even so, I continued on. When I reached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The last sign at the edge of the rural route was twisted in a harsh angle that mirrored all the others. The reflection in the mirror warped it into a looming shape, a beckoning finger of rusted metal. My heart pounded so violently that my vision blurred for a second. I took a deep breath, tried to steady the tremor in my hands, and forced my gaze forward. The road ahead was open, bright with the rising sun, yet the weight of dread never left my chest. It clung to me like a shadow. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape the sense that those signs are still watching. I've tried telling myself it's just old metal and local pranksters, but the memories of those nights, those incessant creaks, the haunting angles, the sign that vanished from my porch, linger in my mind like a living thing. Even now, far from home, I swear I can feel a subtle tension in my surroundings, as if at any moment I might look out the window and see a warped, rusted sign facing me. And I wonder if, somewhere in the silence of those dirt roads, they're still shifting in the dark, twisting inch by inch, pointing back to where I am, always letting me know they haven't given up. That final realization is the most unsettling of all, that I might outrun them physically, but I can't unbind myself from their gaze. The signs are part of the landscape, part of something deeper, older, perhaps, than the roads themselves. I feel it in the tension at the base of my skull, and in the cold sweat that breaks out whenever I recall that first creak of metal. I have no proof of what happened beyond my own experience, but every time I close my eyes, I see them turning, twisting, realigning, waiting for me. It leaves me uneasy, never able to stand still for too long. And every so often, late at night, even in a new place, I'm jolted awake by a sound I can't explain. A low, grating squeal that shoots ice through my veins. I lie there, silent, trying to convince myself it's just a dream. But deep down I know. They're out there, rusted watchers in the dark, watching, waiting. And some things, once they've chosen you, never truly let you go. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped inside that cramped little chalet. The air felt thick, weighted by a palpable tension that seemed to coil around my lungs. My pulse quickened the instant I shut the door behind me, and every hair on the back of my neck prickled in response to some invisible warning. It was supposed to be a refuge, a quiet spot in the wilderness where I could finally catch my breath. Instead, it felt like a slow descent into a nameless dread. I remember the drive through the winding roads, dense woods hemming me in on either side, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I could feel the burn in my knuckles. I tried to convince myself the anxiety I felt was just residual stress from work, not a premonition of anything truly sinister. A colleague had mentioned the place to me in casual conversation, insisting it offered real solitude and a chance to reset. By the time I pulled up to the chalet, I was desperate for that promise of calm. Yet standing there with the key in my hand, I felt only an oppressive sense of being watched. Inside, the single light fixture in the main room flickered erratically, as if it were losing a silent battle with the darkness. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and receding whenever I blinked. The chalet was tiny, just one main living area connected to a compact kitchenette, plus a small bedroom and a modest bathroom. It was enough space for a solitary retreat, but everything about it felt cramped, like the walls were inching closer with every breath I took. I dropped my bags in the bedroom, noticing immediately the stale odor in the air. It reminded me of old dust and damp wood left untouched for too long. The caretaker I had seen briefly upon arrival had merely gestured to the place, offering a few words in a monotone voice about the electricity occasionally flickering. I took note of his uneasy posture. He kept glancing over my shoulder as if expecting to see something standing behind me. When I asked if the chalet had any issues with the plumbing or rodents, he shook his head but avoided making eye contact. I could feel an unspoken tension radiating off him. Despite my suspicions, I said nothing more, eager to settle in and shake off a long day on the road. That first night, exhaustion weighed heavy on my body. I placed a single lamp on the nightstand next to the bed. The lamp's weak yellow glow cast wavering shapes along the wooden walls. I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the other room, telling myself that everything was fine, that I was simply spooked by the novelty of a remote cabin. Lying on my back, I watched the ceiling fan spin lazily overhead, the blade tip slicing through the silence. Just as I felt myself drifting into a light doze, I heard it, a muffled whisper that seemed to come from the nightstand beside me. My eyes snapped open, and a spike of adrenaline surged through my veins. I held my breath, straining to understand what I was hearing. It was like faint chatter, the sort of hushed conversation you might catch behind a wall in an old apartment building. But the chalet was standalone, far from any neighbors. The sound was too close to be coming from outside. My heart thumped hard enough to rattle my ribs. I could practically taste copper in my mouth as my tongue went dry. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, trying to figure out if this was some bizarre dream. Then the whispering intensified, almost as if the speakers were growing more urgent, not wanting me to ignore them. It came in short bursts, hushed syllables overlapping, forming a language I couldn't decipher. Guttural yet oddly melodic. Fear dripped down my spine in a cold sweat. I leaned over, cautiously, and opened the nightstand drawer. The moment I pulled it out, a surge of icy air rushed over me, prickling my skin. The whispers stopped as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. I stared into the empty drawer, baffled. There was nothing but a faint swirl of dust inside. The chill lingered, though. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly slammed the drawer shut. A surge of nausea twisted my stomach. Had I imagined it all in half-sleep? I spent the rest of that night in a state of half-conscious terror, drifting in and out of uneasy slumber. Every time I jolted awake, I scanned the room with wide, searching eyes. Shadows shifted and danced, and the steady hum of the refrigerator became an ominous drone. My muscles tensed so severely that I woke up with cramps in my calves. By the time dawn's pale light crept through the thin curtains, I had barely gotten any real rest. The next day, I tried to shake off the experience by going for a long walk around the chalet's property. The caretaker had mentioned a short trail leading into the woods. Feeling a surge of claustrophobia within the chalet's confines, I decided to explore. Walking along the trail, I couldn't escape the sensation of unseen eyes peering at me from between the trees. The wind hissed through the branches, and occasionally, I'd catch a soft rustling in the undergrowth. My heart hammered at every unexpected sound. I told myself it was just wildlife, maybe a small animal darting away. Yet I couldn't dispel the growing paranoia that I was not alone. By late afternoon, I returned to the chalet, drenched in sweat despite the cool weather. My skin felt clammy, as if I'd been dipped in ice water. Determined to regain a sense of control, I methodically checked every corner, every drawer, and every closet. I found nothing out of the ordinary, no hidden compartments or evidence that someone else had been inside. Still, I kept coming back to the nightstand drawer. I wanted to prove to myself that I had simply experienced a vivid auditory hallucination, perhaps triggered by stress and lack of sleep. That night, I decided to leave the drawer open. I wanted to see if the noises would resume. Around dusk, I prepared a modest dinner in the kitchenette, the overhead light flickering ominously. My hands shook so much that it was difficult to chop vegetables without risking a serious cut. Swallowing bits of food felt like forcing lumps of clay down my throat. Every gulp reminded me of how tense I was, how hyper-aware of my surroundings I had become. When I finally forced myself to go to bed, I propped my pillows up so I could keep my eyes on the nightstand. The drawer was open about halfway, revealing nothing but an empty space. The lamp's soft glow crept into the drawer, chasing away any hint of darkness. Exhausted, I drifted into a light doze, but it couldn't have been more than an hour before I heard the whispers again. They were no longer muffled. They resonated as if coming from some tunnel that passed through the chalet's walls. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might burst from my chest. My breath caught in my lungs, and I could feel the cold sweat beating on my forehead. The voices seemed closer than before, almost as if they were inside the room with me, swirling around the open drawer. Their tone rose and fell, frantic, like individuals locked in heated debate. I wanted to close my eyes and pretend none of it was real, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from that half-open drawer. Panic took hold, and I reached out with trembling fingers to slam the drawer shut. Yet a part of me hesitated, a small spark of curiosity burning through the fear. Something was calling, beckoning, urging me to look deeper. My throat felt parched and my stomach twisted painfully as if trying to wrench itself free from my body. Despite the terror, I leaned closer, close enough to see the worn wood grain inside. In the faint lamplight, nothing appeared unusual. But the sound, those hushed, urgent words, rattled in my skull, impossible to ignore. I found myself recoiling as the voices swelled, and a sudden gust of frigid air whipped past my face. It felt unnatural, as if some portal had opened. Panic flooded every inch of me, and I stumbled out of bed, nearly tripping over the rug. My heart hammered, sweat ran down my temples, and my limbs felt heavy, uncooperative. I finally mustered the will to kick the drawer shut. The voices ceased instantly. The silence that followed was like a vacuum, pressing in on my eardrums until a dull ring lingered. I stood there panting, unsure if what I experienced was real or if I was devolving into a hysterical state. The next day, I was afraid to touch the nightstand at all. Even passing by it sent shivers through my entire body. I tried distracting myself by keeping the television on in the living area, but the static-laced channels only heightened my anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, set my teeth on edge. My mind kept replaying the moment that cold air struck my face, and the urgent chatter that faded the second I shut the drawer. By the time night fell, I was nearing a breaking point. The sense of being watched had grown more intense. While brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom, I saw something flicker in the mirror's reflection, a fleeting shadow that darted behind me. My entire body convulsed with fear, and I spun around, nearly tripping over my own feet, only to find nothing but the faintly lit corridor. My heart raced to the point I felt dizzy. Adrenaline spiked in my veins, making my hands quiver. I considered leaving right then, driving back through the woods in the dead of night, but a curious dread pinned me in place. I felt compelled to see this through, to confront whatever was happening. Part of me believed I was merely hallucinating. Another part feared that if I ran now, I would always wonder if something truly lurked beyond my understanding, using that drawer as a conduit. That evening, I mustered the courage to sit on the edge of the bed with the drawer wide open. My breathing was shallow, my palms slick with sweat. The ceiling fan overhead made a faint clicking noise, adding another layer of tension. The lamplight created dancing shapes on the bedroom walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those shapes were growing more human-like, twisting themselves into impossible forms. After what felt like an eternity, the whispering resumed. It started as a barely perceptible hiss, then rose into a subdued chorus of voices, each overlapping the other. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I felt a surge of cold that spread from the center of my chest outward. I gripped the bed frame to steady myself, certain my legs would buckle if I tried to stand. In that moment, I thought I discerned my own name hidden among the indecipherable language. An icy dread flooded me. I tried to recall if the caretaker or my colleague had ever spoken my name in such a sibilant tone, but it was unrecognizable and terrifying. The room felt impossibly small, as if the walls were pressing forward, funneling me closer to the source of the whispers. I forced myself to approach the drawer, each step heavier than the last. The chill in the air intensified, and I felt goosebumps erupt along my arms. My temples pounded with each rapid heartbeat. I peered inside, and for a split second the woods seemed to distort into a dark tunnel. My breath stuttered, and I nearly dropped to my knees. I imagined a swirling void beyond the splintered interior, something not of this world. Then the image was gone, leaving only emptiness once more. My body trembled with a mixture of terror and raw adrenaline. I couldn't endure another sleepless night listening to those voices, feeling their urgent pull. Summoning a last ounce of resolve, I seized the drawer and yanked it entirely free from the nightstand. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the bedroom. The voices stopped at once, replaced by a suffocating silence. I carried the drawer outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind whistled through the tall pines. My feet crunched on the gravel as I kept moving away from the chalet, deeper into the clearing where the caretaker had said it was safe to gather firewood. I felt as though invisible hands were trying to pull me back, urging me to return to that cursed piece of furniture. My ears rang with phantom whispers. With unsteady arms, I set the drawer down on a patch of bare earth. The rational part of my mind told me this was futile, that I was only fueling my own panic. But the primal, terrified part of me believed I had to remove that object from the chalet. I walked backwards, never taking my eyes off it, half expecting it to move on its own. It did not budge. Back inside, without the drawer, the nightstand looked hollow and strange. The bedroom felt marginally less suffocating, though the air retained a stagnant chill. I collapsed onto the bed, every muscle trembling from exertion and fear. My mouth was dessert dry, and I had to force myself to swallow. Though my heart thudded in my chest, I finally managed a few hours of fitful sleep. Morning came, pale and listless. I hurried outside, half convinced the drawer might have vanished or returned on its own. Instead, I found it exactly where I'd left it, a discarded shell resting under the gray sky. My mind warred between shame at my own irrational behavior and relief that the sinister item hadn't done anything impossible in the night. I resolved to pack my things and leave immediately. There would be no more attempts at stoicism or rationalization. I had reached my limit. By midday, I was on the winding road back toward civilization. The caretaker seemed to notice my shaken expression when I handed him the key. He did not ask questions, merely thanked me in a subdued tone, his gaze darting to the empty space in my car where the drawer might have been. In my rearview mirror, I watched the chalet grow smaller, the surrounding trees swallowing it in a tangle of shadows. My heart felt lighter the farther I drove, but a certain heaviness lingered at the edges of my mind. Weeks later, I still feel that weight. At night in my apartment, I sometimes catch myself staring at my own furniture, half expecting to hear voices emanating from within. I wonder if I truly left whatever haunted that drawer behind, or if a piece of it followed me. Each time my dresser squeaks or my closet door creaks, a faint tremor ripples through me. My rational mind insists it's just the house settling or the wind outside. Yet a knot of tension builds between my shoulders, and I can't seem to banish the lingering dread of that faint, urgent whisper. I manage to escape physically unharmed, but there is a deep unease etched into my bones. I avoided a worse fate, though I'm certain of little else. No matter how many normal days pass, I remain forever on edge, haunted by the memory of cold air rushing at my face and frantic murmurs cutting through the silence. Even now, I question whether that chalet was some kind of threshold, a place where reality thinned and something else seeped through. The part that unnerves me most is how it whispered my name, like it knew me, expected me. No matter how much distance I put between myself and that forest, I still feel as if some corner of my mind is forever trapped in that cramped bedroom, listening to voices that should not exist. I suspect they still speak in that vacant space, behind the nightstand and within its drawer, calling, waiting for anyone bold or desperate enough to take refuge there. That thought alone chills me more than any nightmare, because I sense that even if no one else ever sets foot in that chalet again, whatever spoke to me through that drawer remains, eager for another chance to be heard. And I will never be entirely free of that knowledge. I remember the exact moment I became aware that something was deeply wrong in my home. It started with a sudden tightness in my chest, a split-second prickle of dread, as though my surroundings had grown hungry for my attention. I can still feel the echo of that pulse-pounding instant behind my eyes. There was no clear sign or obvious trigger, only that gnawing sense of alarm telling me that my house, long a silent refuge, was about to reveal a secret I never wanted to discover. I had owned the place for a couple of years, a modest two-story structure with a small yard and a basement that I rarely used. After I moved in, I quickly converted the upstairs rooms into comfortable living spaces and storage areas for old memorabilia. The basement had remained mostly untouched, aside from the occasional visit to check the furnace or retrieve a toolbox. It never struck me as particularly ominous, just outdated, with a damp cement floor and walls that had been repainted countless times by previous owners. In truth, it was bland, but it was that very blandness that made what I discovered all the more startling. I went down there on a Sunday afternoon, chasing down a persistent squeaking noise coming from the pipes. The air was chilly and smelled of dust, a bit sharper than usual, like the scent of old paper and stagnant water. The single overhead bulb cast elongated shadows on the floor, revealing corners and angles in ways I wasn't used to seeing. Stepping around a stack of plastic boxes, I noticed faint lines on the walls, something you would miss if you weren't paying very close attention. They appeared to be gently curving shapes, half circles that overlapped in an intricate, swirling pattern. Curiosity pushed me closer. Brushing aside cobwebs, I could see they formed complete circles in some areas, lines so thin they nearly blended with the paint. At first, I suspected they were cracks or old marks left by a previous renovation, but there was too much symmetry. They looked intentional. My pulse quickened, and a faint prickle ran down my spine. Despite that flicker of unease, I found myself bending down, bringing my face inches from the wall, trying to trace the shapes with my eyes. Without fully thinking, I placed my fingertips against one of the circles. Instantly, a surge of adrenaline surged through my body. My heart went from steady to hammering in my chest, and a low buzzing sound like a wasp caught in glass rippled through the basement. It was so soft I couldn't be sure I heard it at all, but I felt a distinct vibration under my hand, as if the wall itself had come alive. Startled, I yanked my fingers back and stumbled. My breath caught in my throat, and that sense of intrusion, of having touched something forbidden, clung to me. In that moment, my mouth went dry, and I could feel my palms begin to sweat. I hurried back upstairs, muttering to myself that it was probably just static electricity or a trick of my overactive imagination. Maybe the squeaking pipes had momentarily surged, resonating through the walls. That was the reasonable explanation I clung to. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. That night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, fully aware of how restless I felt. My heart refused to settle into its usual rhythm, and my throat had that constricted feeling that comes from unspoken anxiety. The house was quiet, so much so that I could make out the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Then, like clockwork, came the distinct sound of knocks or taps from the basement in a steady, measured sequence. It wasn't frantic or erratic. The tapping was systematic, one after the other, almost like a ritual beat. I felt the hair on my arms rise, and an electric shiver spread along my spine. I tried to rationalize it. I thought, maybe it's the furnace kicking in, but something about those taps felt intentional. I lay there, paralyzed by uncertainty, my breathing shallow. I listened to each knock reverberate through the stillness of the house. My heart pounded so hard I half expected to see the sheets tremble with every beat. I swallowed against a tight dryness in my throat, trying to calm myself. The knocks continued for a while, then faded. I told myself I'd go check it out in the morning, but I slept poorly, half dreaming that the patterns on the walls were throbbing with life. By morning, my courage was partly restored, though my body still felt sore from a night's worth of tension. After breakfast, I forced myself back into the basement, armed with a flashlight. The overhead bulb gave off its usual weak glow, but I needed more light to really see those shapes. As soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, a slight chill enveloped me. It was as if the air itself was thicker there, more resistant. The patterns were easy to spot now, no longer faint or ghostly. They seemed bolder, as though they had been redrawn overnight. Each ring looked fresh and precise, with faint cracks in the paint forming radial lines that seemed to pulse outward. I ran the flashlight over the circles, trying to find some sense in them, maybe a clue that they were old ornamental designs. But the deeper I stared, the more I became convinced they had a purpose, one I couldn't quite fathom. My heart raced as I noticed a slight luminescence in the lines, a feeble, almost imperceptible glow, but definitely there. I felt the gravity of the situation sink in. This was no quirk of a poorly renovated basement. Something else was happening, and it sent a jolt of fresh sweat to my palms. My legs felt unsteady, and I imagined I could hear a distant humming again, lower this time, like a chorus just beyond my range of hearing. I thought about calling a professional, an inspector, or maybe a contractor to come and evaluate the walls, but I hesitated, worried about sounding unhinged. I could almost envision the awkward conversation. I'd have to explain that I saw glowing circles and heard knocking at night. Worse, I feared letting anyone else near them, unsure of what might happen if a stranger touched those shapes. Instead, I told a coworker over coffee that I was considering renovating my basement, hoping he might casually say something like, "Oh yeah, that kind of weird marking is common in older homes." But no such comfort came. He only offered a suggestion of checking for mold or structural damage, none of which explained luminescent patterns. That night, the knocking returned, more forceful this time. It reverberated through the floorboards with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. I felt I was listening to the pulse of the house itself. I had to bite my lip to keep from calling out. My entire body was tense, every muscle rigid with dread. I tried turning on music to drown it out, but the knock seemed to match the tempo of any song I chose, changing pace in a mocking echo. On the third evening, I broke down. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Not a movie, not reading, nothing. The knocks were all I could think about, each one like a jolt to my nervous system. My chest felt tight, and my lungs struggled to draw breath. Finally, out of a desperate, irrational need for peace, I marched downstairs. I was shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my flashlight. My insides felt coiled like a spring, ready to snap. In the basement, the moment I stepped off the final stair, all the hair on my neck stood up. The overhead light flickered as though the electrical wiring had been disturbed. Those circles on the wall now glowed in a muted haze, each ring somehow more pronounced than in the daylight. I can't fully explain how disorienting it was. The shapes seemed to shift if I looked at them for too long, like they were warping or rotating. The buzzing sensation returned, duller than the first time but more insistent, vibrating through the cold floor and into my feet. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came out in ragged gasps. My chest heaved with each inhale, and a cold sweat broke out along my brow. I felt an overwhelming temptation to touch the patterns again, as if they were drawing me in. It was almost like standing on the edge of a cliff, torn between fear of falling and a bizarre urge to lean forward. I clenched my fists, refusing to give in. Despite that, I found myself moving closer, compelled by some invisible force. It was a small jolt of rational thought that yanked me back. I realized I had no idea what touching them again might unleash. My heart hammered so furiously it felt close to bursting. The overhead bulb flickered once more, and I half expected it to burn out, plunging me into darkness. At that moment, I whispered a desperate plea for it to stay lit, my voice cracking with tension. When the light stabilized, I noticed a detail that made my stomach lurch. Behind the swirling circles, faint lines seemed to emerge, almost forming letters or symbols. They were incomplete, half hidden. It felt like a code or some archaic language. My mouth went dry, and an ache crept up my throat. I found myself unable to decipher what I was seeing. Instead, I felt watched, like the basement itself had grown eyes. I stumbled back upstairs, nearly tripping. The moment I left, the hum faded, but the sense of being observed remained. By the time I reached the living room, my hands trembled so severely that I had to sit down. My vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment, I worried I might faint. A rush of fear-induced nausea tightened my stomach. I could not deny it any longer. Those symbols were influencing more than just the walls. They were affecting me, crawling into my mind. My imagination conjured up all sorts of threats, a portal to some hidden dimension, or an ancient curse long dormant. It became almost impossible to function. Over the next few days, I found myself on constant alert, listening for the faintest hint of tapping or humming. Every little noise in the house made me jump. The refrigerator cycling on, the heater clicking. These normal household sounds were amplified into menacing signals. My paranoid thoughts multiplied. Had those patterns always been there, just beneath layers of paint, waiting for someone curious enough to touch them? I began to mistrust even my own senses. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes at night, I could see those circles pulsating. I questioned whether it was a memory or an ongoing hallucination. My dreams turned into roiling storms of swirling lines and muffled knocking. Waking up was only mildly more reassuring, as the real world felt just as twisted. One morning, I noticed something odd in the hallway mirror. My reflection seemed different. My eyes were bloodshot, and there was a tension in my jaw that gave me a haunted appearance. I hadn't truly slept in days. While washing my face, I recalled the faint glow of the symbols and shuddered. The adrenaline spike came again, and the thought that I might be losing my mind crossed my mind. I forced water over my skin, hoping the cool shock would bring me clarity. Instead, my pulse remained in overdrive, and my mind kept returning to the basement. That same evening, as I sat on the couch in my living room, I felt the faintest rumble under my feet. The vibration coursed through the wooden floor, up my spine. At first I thought it might be a small tremor or passing truck, but it built steadily, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to emanate from underneath. Before I knew it, the overhead lights began to dim in unison with each throb. I broke into a cold sweat, my chest constricting with panic. Every breath felt like a monumental effort. Despite my terror, something inside me stirred, a stubborn resolve. I needed to confront it because ignoring it was driving me to the brink. Armed with a heavier flashlight and a handheld mirror, an odd impulse, but I thought I might catch a reflection of something not visible head-on. I made my way downstairs once more. My limbs felt numb with fear, yet tingling with adrenaline. The basement was throbbing with energy. The overhead light flickered wildly now, casting disjointed shadows across the floor. The circular patterns glowed with a sickly luminescence, each ring sharper than before. At the center of the largest symbol, a subtle swirling movement caught my eye, as though the paint itself were alive. I placed the mirror at an angle to observe from a safer distance. My stomach churned. In the reflection, the circles appeared to expand, forming a spiral that reached toward me. My entire body shook with waves of terror. I had the distinct impression that I wasn't just looking at shapes on a wall. I was peering into something that wanted to look back. In that harrowing moment, I considered slamming the mirror to the ground, but I resisted the urge. Instead, I forced myself to speak out loud. My voice wavered, so I repeated my question silently. "What are you?" My heart pounded in my ears, and it felt as if the entire house awaited an answer. Though there was no direct response, the buzzing grew louder, a furious drone that rattled my teeth. My vision swam with dizziness, and I could feel the sweat trickle down my temples. It took every ounce of willpower not to back away in blind panic. For a few moments, I felt my consciousness wavering, as though the basement walls were pressing inward. Then, in the flashlight's beam, the glow seemed to recede, just enough for me to breathe again. It was as if the presence recognized my refusal to yield entirely. Clinging to that thread of resolve, I stepped away from the wall, never letting it out of my sight. I grabbed an old tarp from a nearby shelf and flung it over the largest cluster of symbols. My logic was flimsy. Maybe covering them would block whatever energy was stirring. The moment the tarp settled, the basement plunged into an eerie half-darkness. The humming subsided, only slightly. My shoulders remained bunched with tension, but I felt a microscopic sense of relief. I backed up the stairs, the flashlight bobbing with my trembling hand. As I reached the ground floor, the oppressive weight I'd felt in the basement lifted a fraction. I locked the basement door, though I knew it offered no real barrier against something intangible. Still, the act gave me a psychological crutch. In the living room, I sank onto the couch, my lungs working overtime to catch my breath. My muscles burned with exhaustion. I spent the next few hours bathed in anxiety, bracing for the knocks or the hum. They never came. The house was silent, too silent. I dozed off at some point, a restless, uneasy sleep. In my half-conscious state, I dreamt of swirling lines colliding with each other, trying to form a figure that was always out of focus. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the windows, and for the first time in days, I felt some measure of calm. I considered my options: call someone, try to cleanse the place with some unscientific ritual, or simply get out. But the property was mine. Running felt premature. Plus, I worried that if there was any lingering force tied to me, leaving might not solve anything. So I decided to open that basement door once more in daylight, to see if covering the symbols had truly made a difference. When I finally worked up the courage to unlock it, I felt a gush of stale air push past me, as though the house exhaled. Carefully, I peeked downstairs. The tarp remained in place, covering most of the wall. No humming, no luminous glow, The overhead bulb flicked on normally. My chest felt slightly less constricted, and for a moment, I dared to hope. I haven't removed that tarp since. The memory of that creeping luminescence and the pulsating walls remains etched into my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine I hear a faint tapping. Perhaps it's just my own blood thrumming in my ears. Maybe it's nothing at all. Yet I can't shake the feeling that something in the basement continues to watch and wait. The knowledge that those swirling patterns remain hidden but not gone gnaws at my peace. Despite my attempts at normalcy, the question of what they truly are hangs over me like a storm cloud. Even now, whenever I stand near the basement door, my pulse races, and a phantom vibration courses through my fingertips. Part of me wants to pry the tarp away, to see if those symbols have grown or changed. Another part insists that it's best left alone, that there are forces I'm not equipped to comprehend. And so I live with this precarious balance. On one side, the day-to-day life of work, errands, and routine. On the other, an unsettling secret waiting just beneath my feet. I can't say I've found closure. Maybe I never will. But for now, I remain here, coexisting with the unknown. Every beat of my heart reminding me of that hidden presence below. It's a fragile piece at best, haunted by the memory of those impossible circles and the whispered promise of something beyond my understanding. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of it. Yet I stay, holding on to the faint hope that leaving them covered will keep the nightmares at bay, all the while bracing for the day they might call to me again. I first sensed something was wrong the moment my headlights swept across that desolate stretch of asphalt, revealing nothing but a thin ribbon of road cutting through a void of darkness. There was a heaviness in the air that night, a density that pressed down on my chest and made every breath feel labored. The moon hung low, partly obscured by looming clouds, and the wind carried an unsettling hush. Right then, as soon as I merged onto that lonely highway, I felt as though something was watching me. A prickle ran up my spine before I could even put the car in drive. It was an immediate and visceral reaction, and it clung to me like a second skin, setting my nerves on edge. I work late, always have. My boss's demands keep me at the office when most people are already at home, unwinding from the day. So I've grown accustomed to driving back under the moon's pale glare. I never thought much of it, until the night I noticed a single headlight behind me, bobbing in the distance like a disembodied eye. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion, or perhaps a truck on the road with a broken headlight. But the way it appeared out of nowhere, right in my rear view, made my stomach clench. The first time I saw that headlight, I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe an old motorcycle on the road. But it never got closer, not enough for me to make out a license plate, not enough for me to wave it on if it wanted to pass. It simply hovered behind me, matching my pace, almost as if it were tethered to my rear bumper. My palms grew slick with sweat, and I fiddled nervously with the radio in an attempt to calm down. By the time I glanced up at the mirror again, the headlight had vanished. There was no sign of a turnoff, no intersection, no silhouette of a vehicle retreating into the distance, just a yawning expanse of empty road. As the days passed, I convinced myself I'd been seeing things. Overtime, stress, lack of proper sleep. Surely that could conjure illusions in a tired mind. I started going to bed earlier, tried to eat better and drink less coffee, hoping that would fortify me against any late-night hallucinations. Yet, no matter what I changed in my routine, I couldn't forget that floating headlight. It had left an imprint on my mind like a burn mark that refused to heal. A week later, it appeared again. I'd left work around the same time as usual, around midnight, feeling a slight tension in the air. My body was stiff from sitting in front of the computer all day, and my eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets. By the time I reached that unlit stretch of highway, my only companion was the gentle thrum of the car's engine. The tension in my neck had blossomed into a full-blown ache. I slowed the car, wanting a moment to flex my shoulders and find some relief from the pain. That was when I saw it, a single orb of light in the mirror, flickering faintly in the distance. My heart rate jumped so suddenly that I felt lightheaded, and I had to remind myself to keep breathing. A sheen of sweat broke out on my forehead. I told myself it was just a vehicle, nothing more. I accelerated a bit, hoping the other driver would catch up and pass me. But no, it maintained its distance, unwavering, like it was pacing me. My mouth went dry. The road was so empty that if this driver wanted to pass, they could have done it easily. Yet they chose not to. I tried to tell myself that maybe they felt safer trailing behind, letting me lead through the darkness, or perhaps the driver was also fatigued and simply mirroring my speed. But my heart hammered against my ribcage like it was begging to break free. My gut told me something was wrong. I tapped my brakes gently, just to see. The headlight dipped in tandem, as though it sensed my hesitation and responded with equal caution. It never once tried to overtake me. That made my skin crawl, because it felt personal, like it was more than just coincidence. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel to the point of pain. In a surge of frustration, I slowed to nearly a crawl, expecting the trailing vehicle to pass. Instead, it slowed too. That was when I felt real fear, raw and electric, biting at the back of my neck. The headlight followed me for a full 5 minutes like this. My arms were shaking, and I kept rubbing my palms on my jeans to wipe away the sweat. The engine's steady drone and my own ragged breathing were the only sounds in the world at that point. My throat constricted, and I felt an irrational impulse to pull over. But the idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere, with this unknown presence behind me, felt too terrifying. So, I kept driving, a little faster, trying to outrun whatever it was. In a fleeting moment of desperation, I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone or something. That's how strong the sensation of being watched had become. The seat was empty, of course, but the feeling only grew stronger. My heart thudded like a warning drum, and each exhale came out as a shaky sigh. When I finally mustered the courage to look in the rear view again, the headlight was gone, dissolved into the blackness as if it had never existed. My relief was immediate but short-lived, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. There was nowhere it could have turned. No intersections, no side roads, not even a wide shoulder. It vanished into thin air, and I couldn't shake the thought that it was toying with me. When I arrived home that night, I barely slept. The next morning, I recalled it only in fragments. The single beam of light trailing me, the goosebumps prickling my arms, my heart pounding in my ears. I told a coworker in passing that something unsettling had happened on my drive, but I kept it vague. I'm not sure I wanted to hear anyone tell me it was just in my head, because the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was something else, something beyond logic or reason, lurking on that deserted road. Over the following nights, I did everything I could to avoid traveling that path. I tried taking a longer route, circling through side streets or well-lit roads, as if streetlights could somehow keep the nightmare at bay. That worked for a while, and I started to feel more at ease. Yet my schedule at work remained demanding, and eventually, I found myself too exhausted to drive the extra miles. Slowly, I returned to that lonely highway, and in time, the headlights returned for me. The third time it happened, I noticed more details. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the sky was moonless, the stars swallowed by looming storm clouds. My body was drenched in tension, and I felt a chill creeping up my spine even with the heater on low. Then, in my peripheral vision, I detected that faint glowing point in the mirror. Almost immediately my mouth went dry and I started to tremble. My mind reeled through half a dozen explanations, but none stuck. The dread was too immediate, too visceral. It couldn't be dismissed as random. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road ahead, determined not to obsess over the mirror. But that primal fear was overwhelming. My pulse hammered in my throat, my ears rang, and I found it difficult to swallow. Each time my eyelids fluttered, tiny sparks of panic ignited in my chest, imagining that the next time I looked up, that headlight would be right on my bumper. And in an almost self-fulfilling prophecy, it did move closer, until it was practically flooding my back window with white light. My entire car glowed like I was suddenly center stage under a single blazing spotlight. I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw throbbed. My mind buzzed with questions. Who would do this? Why not pass? Why appear so abruptly as if conjured from nowhere? A surreal sense of claustrophobia overwhelmed me, as though the light was pressing in from all sides. My heart rate thundered in my chest, and a cold sweat trickled down my temple. I was sure I'd have to brake hard or risk losing control of the wheel with my trembling arms. Just when I couldn't take the tension any longer, it vanished. In a blink, the road behind me was dark. My breath caught in my lungs, and a disoriented nausea swept over me. I glanced around, half expecting to see a faint pair of headlights on some distant curve. But the highway was a vacant expanse, illuminated only by my rear lights. There had been no exit, no turnoff, not even a hidden driveway. Yet the light was gone as though it had never existed. My gut twisted, and I felt a wave of dizziness that forced me to pull over. My hands were shaking so badly that I worried I might crash if I kept driving in that state. I sat there on the shoulder with my hazard lights blinking. My breathing came in shallow gasps, and my heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the night's silence. I switched off my headlights, momentarily plunging myself into absolute darkness. That decision lasted all of 2 seconds before I panicked and turned them back on. The thick gloom made me imagine shapes moving in the blackness, like the entire night was alive and circling me. My skin crawled with the notion that I wasn't alone. By the time I got home, I felt like I was on the brink of a breakdown. Lying in bed, I couldn't drift off, because each time I closed my eyes, I saw that single, glaring headlight. My limbs jerked involuntarily whenever the memory of it getting too close rushed back to me. Sleep was fitful, haunted by half-formed images of someone or something driving inches behind me, unwavering in its pursuit. Over the next few days, I questioned my sanity. I even contemplated seeing a doctor, maybe getting my eyes checked. But this phenomenon defied rational explanation. It didn't matter if I left work a bit earlier or a bit later. It would eventually find me on that deserted highway. And with each sighting, the experience grew more intense. Now it wasn't just about the headlight. I felt like I could hear an engine revving behind me, a low, throaty hum that vibrated through my seat. I would grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, certain that at any moment, the mysterious vehicle would slam into me from behind. Once, in my desperation, I confided in a friend who noticed my jumpiness. I spoke in halting terms, explaining that I felt harassed by some phantom driver on my nightly commutes. He responded with a skeptical tone, asking if it could be a trick of the light or maybe local teens playing pranks. I felt no comfort in his reassurances. Deep inside, my instincts warned me that this was something else, something not bound by the usual rules. I tried recording it with my phone, mounting it on the dashboard as I started my drive, but the camera never picked up anything. As soon as that glowing orb appeared, I'd glance at the phone, and it showed only empty blackness behind me. This mismatch between what I saw with my own eyes and what the device recorded took the terror to a new level. The logical part of my brain whispered that nothing was there, that I should go home, forget this nonsense, and take a break. But every nerve in my body screamed the opposite. Tension reached its peak on one of the stormiest nights of the year. Rain lashed at my windshield, and thunder snarled across the sky. Each bolt of lightning illuminated the highway in stark flashes, revealing the same lonely stretch that I had come to dread. I had left the office later than I wanted, and my shoulders were already stiff with anxiety. As soon as I hit that familiar patch of road, I felt my stomach lurch. Something inside me knew the headlight would come. The highway was slick with rain, my wipers working furiously. My breath fogged the interior despite the defrost setting. Sure enough, there it was, a faint pinprick in my rearview mirror, shimmering like a star in a swirling galaxy of darkness and rain. My heart lurched into my throat. Instinctively, I pressed the accelerator, wanting to put distance between myself and that hypnotic light. But it sped up as well, closing in, inch by inch. until once again it was so bright that my rear windshield glowed white. My pulse hammered as lightning tore across the sky, momentarily revealing the road behind me. And in that split second, I expected to see a vehicle's outline. Some make or model, a shape, anything tangible. But I saw nothing. The road was as empty as the void, yet the light persisted, throbbing like an artificial sun in my mirror. My entire body locked up with raw panic. My breathing turned shallow and frantic, and my vision blurred at the edges. The noise of the storm, the frantic wipers, my pounding heart, they all merged into a deafening roar that made it impossible to think straight. Suddenly, I made a choice. I slammed on the brakes, not caring about skidding or hydroplaning. I just couldn't bear another moment of this chase. My car fishtailed, the tires squealing on the wet pavement. My seatbelt dug into my chest, and I gripped the wheel, wrestling to keep the car from spinning out. When the car finally stopped, my body was trembling like I'd been caught in a freezing blizzard. I twisted around, fully expecting to see that headlight behind me, ready to crash into my bumper. But there was nothing. No glow, no engine hum, nothing. Rain pelted my windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. My eyes struggled to focus in the dim light, but the highway was deserted. It was as if that impossible illumination had winked out of existence in the mere blink of an eye. I felt a strangled sob catch in my throat. Every fiber in my being was on high alert, expecting the light to return, to materialize right beside me, or perhaps in front of me this time. But the night remained silent, cloaked in sheets of rain and rolling thunder. My breath rattled with each exhale, and a deep shiver set into my bones. Slowly, I coaxed my car back onto the road, driving with a hypervigilance that made my shoulders ache. When I finally got off that highway, I pulled into a roadside gas station, a single island of light in an ocean of darkness. I left the car running as I stepped out under the flickering fluorescent canopy, letting the rain drench my hair and clothes. It was a miserable feeling, but it at least proved I was still here, in reality, physically grounded. I stared at the empty road behind me, half expecting a silent, glowing orb to appear beyond the watery halo of the station's lights. Yet all I saw was blackness. I haven't seen the headlights since that night. Still, every time I merge onto that same stretch of road, I feel a surge of dread. My body reacts before my mind even has time to process. My pulse quickens, my palms become clammy, and I brace myself for the reappearance of that phantom glow. It's like a reflex now, an inevitability etched into my nerves. Even though weeks have passed, I can't shake the suspicion that it's out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I sometimes swear I can hear a low engine rumble at the far edges of my hearing, but when I check the mirror, there's nothing but my own anxious face staring back. I can't say with certainty what it was. A ghost? A hallucination? Or something that slips through cracks in reality on lonely roads late at night? I've tried telling myself it was only my imagination running wild, fueled by exhaustion and stress. Yet, deep down, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me. Something that hasn't entirely let go. To this day, whenever I'm alone in my car at night, I catch myself glancing into the rearview mirror more often than necessary, my heart pounding, expecting to see that solitary beam of light glaring back at me. And maybe, one night, it will return. Each time I drive down that deserted stretch, my body seizes with a familiar dread, and my vision narrows. A single thought resonates in my mind, like a haunting refrain. I am never truly alone on that road, and it terrifies me. I wish I could say the fear has faded, but it's more accurate to say I've learned to live with it. My life goes on. I wake, work, and drive home, repeating the same routine. But there's a new edge to my perception, a permanent awareness that something impossible has brushed against my reality. And no matter how many days or years pass, I'll always remain on that precipice of terror, wondering if, at any moment, the world behind me will light up once more with that single, relentless headlight. It's a question that keeps me awake at night even when I'm safe under my own roof. Because some horrors don't need a reason, and some answers might be worse than the questions we ask. Still remember the way the corridor lights buzzed that night, casting harsh, wavering shadows across the office floor. The entire building felt alive in the worst possible way, like the architecture itself was inhaling and exhaling in shallow, erratic breaths. Each flicker of fluorescence seemed more pronounced than the last, and every silent pause amplified the pounding of my heart. I had stayed far too late, and the surrounding emptiness was not just an inconvenience, but a tangible menace. That was the first sign, the oppressive quiet that blanketed everything, so thick it felt as though the walls were ready to close in and swallow me whole. I had agreed to put in overtime, though no one really asked me. I sensed my supervisor's displeasure if I refused. The entire day had been tense, full of looming deadlines and a swirl of last-minute tasks. By the time night fell, the place was deserted. The interns had gone home first, followed by a trickle of coworkers. Eventually, only I remained, determined to finish my work on the top floor. Sometime around midnight, the hush of the corridors became overwhelming, punctuated by the low hum of the air conditioning system. It was then I heard an unexpected sound, a faint whirring, like a vacuum cleaner or some cleaning equipment. The sound cut in and out, drifting up from the hallway just outside my office door. At first, it was a minor curiosity. I reasoned that the cleaning staff must have been running late, or simply on a different schedule. Yet there was something odd about the timbre of that noise. It wasn't quite the normal mechanical drone of modern vacuums. It had a coarse, scratchy undertone, as though the equipment were an older model struggling to remain functional. I checked the time on my computer screen, a few minutes past midnight. My nerves started to prickle, partly from exhaustion and partly from unease. The overhead lamp on my desk flickered, making the shadows ripple across the walls. I tried to brush off my discomfort by thinking I was just exhausted. However, the vacuum noise continued, taking on a grating, insistent pitch that I couldn't ignore. I decided to step into the hallway for a break, maybe stretch my legs and reassure myself that everything was normal. As I opened my office door, I felt a slight breeze against my face, cold and unnaturally sharp, as though a window at the end of the corridor had been opened. But I knew all the windows there had been sealed shut ages ago. I looked around, half expecting to see the usual nighttime cleaning crew. Instead, I spotted a solitary figure wearing a uniform that looked strangely outdated. The cloth seemed to be a faded grayish blue, with lettering on the back that was barely visible, but unmistakably spelled out the initials of a company I recognized only from old files. It was the name of a cleaning contractor that had gone bankrupt over 20 years ago. The man stood hunched, head down, sweeping the floor without making a single audible rustle. The broom's bristles met the floor, but I heard no scrape, no swish, nothing at all. Confused, I took a tentative step forward, feeling the hair on my arms stand on end. My mouth went dry, and I had to force myself to swallow. I felt compelled to speak, though my voice trembled even in my own mind. I tried addressing him, but he gave no sign of acknowledgement. He remained bent over the broom, sweeping the same spot repeatedly as if he were stuck in a loop. I remembered shifting my weight from one foot to the other, trying to decide what to do. My instincts screamed to retreat, yet some rational corner of my mind kept urging me to approach the figure for an explanation. Perhaps he was just wearing an old uniform, maybe leftover from a storage closet. I coughed to clear my throat and took another step closer, but there was still no response. By that point, my heart was drumming so loud I could feel it in my ears. Something about his posture struck me as deeply unsettling, too rigid, too stiff, as though his spine were locked in place. He never lifted his face from its downward gaze. The silence was monstrous. Even the flickering overhead lights seemed hushed, as if they were afraid to draw attention to themselves. Eventually, I retreated into my office without another word, deciding that I had neither the courage nor the energy to press the issue. I locked the door, leaning against it to steady my frayed nerves. My shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat, and I felt my breath catch as the adrenaline refused to subside. I told myself that I should just pack up and leave. It was late, I was tired, and nothing good ever came from overextending yourself in a near-empty office building long after midnight. but a stubborn part of me insisted on finishing one final spreadsheet. Perhaps I believed burying myself in work would distract me from the sense of unease. As I sat down at my desk, my hands trembled over the keyboard. The room's silence was amplified by the knowledge that outside my door, there was a man, or something that looked like a man, performing an action that should have been accompanied by normal, mundane sounds. But none existed. Time seemed to crawl, and every so often I glanced at the small gap underneath the office door, expecting to see feet shuffling by or the shadow of a broom handle. Yet there was nothing, just an unchanging hollow silence. When I finally decided I'd had enough, I logged off my computer and started gathering my belongings. My legs felt unsteady as I stood. I passed by the door, half hoping the figure had finished his task and gone elsewhere. Then, a sudden jolt made me freeze. The doorknob rattled violently. Someone on the other side was trying to twist it open, applying force as if determined to break in. My heart thundered, and I staggered backward, nearly toppling my office chair. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I whispered to myself, repeating that I must stay quiet, must not make a sound, though I wasn't sure what difference it would make. The rattling persisted for several gut-churning seconds. I glanced at the thin line of light beneath the door. Something stood there. I could see the blocked-out space where feet should be. I crouched, leaning in just enough to peer through the gap. My entire body trembled with each heartbeat. What I witnessed nearly made me gasp. The outline of the figure was unmistakable. The same uniform, the same rigid stance. But the face was all wrong. In fact, there was no face at all. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was a featureless expanse of pale skin. He remained perfectly still, except for his hands gripping the doorknob. I felt nauseated, as if the floor had suddenly shifted. The man's existence violated every sense of reason I possessed. Panic seized me. I pressed my shoulder against the door, praying the lock would hold. My breath became shallow and ragged, and I could almost hear my own pulse, a rapid staccato that hammered against my eardrums. Time stretched, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. Perhaps I had dozed off or hallucinated from stress, but the doorknob continued to jerk, and I could feel the vibrations under my hand. This was no dream. Eventually, the rattling stopped. A long, dreadful silence followed, so profound I could barely stand it. I stayed motionless, straining to catch any hint of movement outside. Slowly, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to steady my breathing. A small, irrational part of me hoped that if I stayed very still, the figure would vanish. And for a moment I thought it had. No more clattering on the door, no shadow, no shape interrupting the light. I waited a few more minutes before mustering the courage to open the door. My hand shook so badly it took 2 tries to grip the knob firmly. I turned it, inching the door open. The hallway was empty. There were no footprints, no debris from the broom, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The silence taunted me, like it was mocking my fear. My brain spun in circles trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I made my way to the elevator, hugging the wall as I moved. The flickering lights in the corridor seemed more erratic, as if on the verge of shorting out altogether. Each step felt like a marathon, and my skin tingled with the constant sensation of being watched. My eyes darted between the empty offices, expecting that faceless shape to lunge out at any moment. My body was a bundle of tension and sweat. The dryness in my mouth was overwhelming. I could barely swallow. Finally, I reached the elevator bank. I stabbed the button repeatedly, desperate for the doors to open. When the elevator bell chimed, the sudden sound made my heart leap uncomfortably in my chest. I scrambled inside and pushed the ground floor button. In that brief instant, I caught a reflection in the elevator's brushed metal interior, a shape at the end of the hallway, so distant it was barely discernible, yet it filled me with horror. It was the man, silently sweeping the floor, his posture unchanged. The doors closed before I could see more, but I felt the weight of his presence linger. My chest tightened, and a chill passed through my body, as though I had just glimpsed something that shouldn't exist in the realm of the living. The elevator's descent was agonizingly slow. The overhead light flickered, creating a strobe effect that set my nerves on edge. With each passing floor, I felt my anxiety spike, as if the building were intentionally slowing my escape. When the doors finally slid open on the ground floor, I stumbled out into the lobby. The night security guard was seated behind a desk, eyes heavy with the boredom of the late shift. I approached him, struggling to maintain my composure. My words came out in fragments, and I'm sure my eyes were wide with panic. He picked up on my distress, though he tried to remain calm. He asked what happened, and I tried to explain the figure I'd seen upstairs. He looked surprised, insisting no one else was supposed to be there. According to his records, I was the only employee left in the building, and the upper floor had been locked down hours ago. He mentioned that no cleaning crew was scheduled that night. The next shift would only arrive early in the morning. My throat felt tight, and I fought the urge to double-check if I had somehow misread the situation. However, the old uniform, the lack of any sound from the broom, the featureless face, all of it flooded back into my mind, impossible to dismiss. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he got up to check the security monitors, scanning each floor. Apparently, everything looked still and empty. He insisted that if I was frightened, I should go home, and he assured me he'd do a patrol of the premises. I followed his advice immediately, practically running across the dimly lit parking lot to my car. The night air clung to my skin, and my nerves were still raw, making me jump at every shift of shadow or rustle of wind. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Once in the driver's seat, I locked the doors and sat there trying to steady my breathing. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot hummed overhead, and I kept expecting to see that motionless figure in the rearview mirror. As I drove away, I couldn't silence the haunting thought that somehow that faceless entity was still in the building, eternally sweeping the empty halls of a company that no longer existed. The presence felt too real to have been a stress-induced hallucination. I tried to recall every detail, dissecting the memory for anything that would point to a trick of the light or an overworked imagination. Yet each recollection felt more vivid than the last. The clammy sweat on my back, the dryness in my mouth, and the incessant hammering of my heart were all visceral. There was nothing dreamlike about it. In the days that followed, I found myself reluctant to return to the office after dark. I began leaving earlier, even if my workload was heavy. My supervisor expressed confusion, as I had once been the late-night warrior, always willing to stay behind and perfect a report. Now, I rushed to pack up the moment the sun began to set. I kept telling myself that maybe I had simply pushed my mind too far that night. Yet the simplest explanation never felt satisfying. My anxiety manifested as insomnia, leaving me exhausted during the day. Occasionally, I'd find my thoughts wandering back to the broom that moved in complete silence, or the doorknob that rattled with malevolent force. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of that old uniform in my peripheral vision, only to realize it was just a coworker's jacket or a misplaced cleaning rag. The fear lingered, a low-level hum of dread. I confided in a friend once, describing the incident in careful, measured language to avoid sounding too hysterical. He tried to comfort me, suggesting I must have conflated normal events with an overworked mind. But I knew that rationalization would never explain that blank face. No human expression, no eyes or mouth, just a smooth, pallid surface that made my skin crawl whenever I recalled it. I continued avoiding overtime, refusing to put myself in a situation where I'd be alone on that floor again. Yet, time marches on, and responsibilities pile up. There eventually came another project that demanded late nights. I negotiated to work from a lower floor, quietly convincing my supervisor that I could be more productive in a space closer to the exit. I never explained the real reason. Still, every once in a while, I heard faint phantom sounds, a distant whirring or the subtle swish of a broom. Each time, I tried to suppress my panic, convincing myself it was only the ventilation or a creaky pipe. On rare occasions, I'd speak with the night security guard, who insisted nothing unusual ever showed up on the cameras, though he admitted that the feeds had blind spots. He made vague mentions of older staff who used to talk about strange happenings long after the bankrupt company had vacated the premises. The stories usually ended with employees sensing an inexplicable presence or hearing footsteps when no one was there. I said little in response, not wanting to reveal how closely it mirrored my experience. My anxiety surged each time he touched on the topic, and I had trouble swallowing the lump in my throat. As the months passed, the terror receded into a quieter form of paranoia. I still dreaded solitary moments in the office at night, but I no longer experienced the same intensity of raw panic, unless I heard any mechanical hum or a broom-like shuffle. Then my pulse would spike, my palms would slick with sweat, and I'd feel an uncontrollable urge to look over my shoulder. Yet, the faceless man never reappeared. Part of me questioned whether that was a good or bad sign. Could it be that I had glimpsed something that only manifests once for each unlucky observer? Or was I teetering on the edge of another confrontation, one I might not escape so easily? I still cling to the memory of locking my office door, feeling it rattle under a furious grip from the other side. The sensation of dread was so potent that each retelling brings back a fragment of that sweaty, trembling terror. And I can't shake the suspicion that if I wander alone on that top floor again, I might find him, or it, stuck in an endless loop of sweeping, wearing the insignia of a company that hasn't existed for decades. In some ways, escaping that night was the easy part. Now I live with the knowledge that certain corners of our reality don't necessarily follow the rules we assume. There's a presence in that building, something bound to those sterile corridors, repeating a menial task without rest or reason. The worst part is the overwhelming silence it carries with it, a silence that defies logic. I left that night, but I never truly left the memory behind. Even now, if I catch the faintest echo of a vacuum cleaner after hours or spot a flicker of movement where there shouldn't be any, my heart rate skyrockets. I swallow hard, my lips go dry, and I remember that featureless face pressed against my door. In my nightmares, I see the broom gliding over the floor in perpetual silence, a horrifying parody of routine maintenance. And in those dreams, he always looks up. I can't see his eyes. He has none. But I feel them on me, as if he's aware of my presence in a way no ordinary being could be. I still go to work, but I never feel entirely safe once the sun sets. It's as though the building itself holds its breath, waiting for the right moment to remind me that there are corners of existence beyond my understanding. The memory of that vacuum's raspy drone lingers, accompanied by the image of a uniform that belongs to a forgotten era. I escaped that night, but I remain haunted by an unanswered question. What truly roams those halls when no one is watching? And will it ever let me forget that it found me, if only for a moment, trapped behind a locked door with my heart slamming against my rib cage? These days, I make sure I'm never the last to leave. I find petty excuses, meetings, errands, scheduling conflicts, anything to avoid the solitude of a silent corridor. My coworkers might find me oddly skittish, but they don't press the issue. In the end, I have accepted that what I saw remains beyond easy explanation. I don't need anyone else's validation to confirm the dread I felt that night. It's etched into my bones, a permanent scar reminding me that some apparitions do not follow normal logic. They are drawn to loneliness, to deserted offices, to the precise moment when you realize you're utterly alone. I don't know whether it's some restless spirit, a residual echo of the past, or simply a manifestation of my own psychological strain. But I do know what I saw in that corridor. And I know I locked my door in terror, only to have it shaken by something that had no face. That knowledge weighs on me even now, an enduring specter lingering in my mind long after I fled the building. Even though I physically walked out unscathed, a part of me is still trapped up there, listening to the silent sweep of an ancient broom in a place where it no longer belongs.